The Viking Age, spanning from roughly 793 to 1066 AD, marked a period of profound transformation in European history, a time of exploration, expansion, and often violent raids. The Vikings were a people whose presence was felt far beyond the shores of Scandinavia. Their swift ships, known as longships, carried them across the seas, their destinations as far-reaching as the British Isles, the coasts of France, and even the distant shores of North America. The Viking raids, which began in earnest with the attack on the Lindisfarne monastery in 793, became infamous, capturing the imaginations of many. But while their raids are the most commonly remembered aspect of Viking history, their exploration and settlement were just as significant. The Vikings not only ravaged but also settled, leaving a lasting impact on the lands they occupied, establishing kingdoms in places such as Normandy in France and Danelaw in England, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The three major Viking kingdoms each played a key role in this era. These kingdoms, born of necessity and shaped by the harsh landscapes of northern Europe, had to adapt to survive. Their people were far from the stereotypical image of ruthless warriors. They were craftsmen, farmers, and traders who balanced the demands of daily life with the brutal necessity of war. Within these societies, social structure was key. Chieftains and kings led their people, warriors fought for glory and survival, and farmers and craftsmen worked diligently to ensure that their communities could thrive in a land that often provided only the barest of resources. Life in Viking society was rooted in this need for survival. The land was harsh, the winters long and unyielding, and the sea both a source of sustenance and a constant threat. Every day in a Viking settlement was a fight against nature, against hunger, and against the ever-present possibility of raids from rival tribes or enemies. Even the most skilled warrior could not escape the realities of living in such an unforgiving environment. Every aspect of Viking life was marked by this struggle, from the simple act of planting crops in the rocky soil to the long hours spent crafting weapons or repairing ships. Now, imagine yourself in the heart of Viking life. The cold wind cuts sharply across the landscape. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore is ever present, and the sky, heavy and gray, feels as though it's always on the brink of releasing the next storm. You step into a Viking village where the people move with purpose, their faces weathered by years of exposure to the elements. The air smells of wood smoke and brine, and the sound of axes chopping wood and the rhythmic clinking of metal being forged fills the air. Life here is harsh, defined by the relentless need for survival. There is no comfort, no luxury, only the drive to endure. As you settle into this world, we will guide you through 4 key aspects of Viking life. In the first segment, we will explore the daily hardships of Viking life. From the constant vigilance required to survive in a land that offers little by way of warmth or sustenance to the emotional and physical toll of constant labor. From the long, cold winters to the seasonal raids, the Vikings' lives were defined by necessity. In the second segment, we will step into the life of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, a figure whose story reflects both the valor and the tragedy of the Viking warrior. His saga, full of feats and betrayals, encapsulates the essence of what it meant to be a Viking, in a world where glory and death often went hand in hand. The third segment will delve into the mysterious voyages of Viking explorers, whose seafaring journeys took them to lands both near and far. We'll uncover the secrets of their navigation, the tools they used, and the vast oceans they crossed, all in the pursuit of conquest, trade, and discovery. Finally, we'll examine the contrasting lives of Viking royalty and their warriors. While the common Vikings fought to survive, the royal elites lived in relative comfort, surrounded by luxury and power. This division between the elite and the everyday Viking speaks to the complex social structure that defined their world. As we embark on this journey, let your mind drift through the rugged landscapes and storm-tossed seas of the Viking world. The story we'll tell is not one of pure glory or reckless violence, but one of struggle, resilience, and a constant fight for survival. A life that, despite its harshness, left a lasting legacy in the history of Europe. Now, take a deep breath and prepare to step into the world of the Vikings, where the rhythm of life is defined by the relentless pulse of survival, and every day is a battle against the cold and the unknown. Imagine, if you will, the bleak, frozen landscape of Scandinavia. The world around you is covered in a thick blanket of snow, the ground hard and unyielding beneath your feet. The sun barely rises, casting only a faint glow on the horizon, leaving the village in a perpetual twilight. as the darkness of winter stretches for months. This is a world where daylight is a precious commodity, and each day feels like a battle against the element. The long nights are cold and unrelenting, a constant reminder of how fragile life is in such a harsh environment. The Viking world, with its long, brutal winters, profoundly shaped the people who lived there. The cold wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a constant threat. As the months wore on, the Vikings had to rely on every tool, every method they could muster to survive the frigid temperatures. The air was so cold it felt as though it could bite through the thickest cloak. If you were a Viking, you spent much of your time huddled against the cold, waiting for the brief moments of warmth provided by the flickering fire in your hearth. The physical environment wasn't just an external hardship, it also wore on the psyche. Imagine the psychological toll of these long, dark winters. The cold seemed to seep into your bones, a heavy weight that seemed to slow down time itself. In such conditions, the Vikings developed an unparalleled resilience. They learned to embrace the harshness of their environment, becoming tough, hard-worn people whose very existence was defined by survival. This resilience was deeply embedded in their culture. After all, their very survival depended on it. The winter months brought not just physical cold, but a kind of isolation that could test even the strongest individuals. As the days shortened and the nights lengthened, the Vikings found themselves living in darkness for long stretches, with the frozen world outside offering little but more of the same: cold, isolation, and a never-ending cycle of survival. Now, imagine stepping into a Viking home. It is small, simple, and functional, a refuge from the endless cold outside. The houses were often made of timber, with thatched roofs or walls built from turf, which were meant to insulate against the cold but offered little in terms of comfort or luxury. These homes were usually one-room structures where entire families lived in close quarters, their daily lives dictated by the needs of survival. As you enter, the first thing you notice is the warmth of the central hearth. The hearth, the heart of the home, would be burning with a fire that provided the only heat and light in the house. This fire was not just for cooking, but for warmth and light during the long, dark nights. The warmth radiating from the hearth was a small comfort against the biting cold of the outside world, but it was also a reminder of the constant vigilance required to keep the fire burning. If it went out, the family could freeze. In a place where wood was precious, the constant need to gather and chop firewood was an ongoing task. The air inside the home is thick with smoke from the fire, a constant presence that coats the walls, the clothes, and the furniture with a faint, pungent odor. The interior feels damp, the moisture in the air from the constant burning of wood adding to the chill that creeps in from the walls. Despite the fire, the house remains cold and drafty. The thick stone floors provide little warmth, and there is often a constant, nagging sense of dampness in the air. The smell of burning wood is pervasive. It lingers on your skin, in your hair, and in the very fabric of your clothes. It's a smell that seems to seep into the walls themselves, part of the constant cycle of life in the Viking world. In the evening, families would gather around the hearth, sharing stories or meals, with the crackling of the fire providing a gentle background to the rhythm of daily life. In these small, cramped spaces, Vikings had to be resourceful and practical. There was little room for indulgence. Each item had a purpose, and every inch of space was used for something essential. Beds were small, and families often slept together for warmth, wrapped in furs and blankets. These homes were not places of comfort, but of survival. The very structure of the house was a reflection of the people who lived within it. Resilient, practical, and ever mindful of the dangers that lay outside. Now, let us turn to the critical issue of food. In a world where the land could be unforgiving, and the winters lasted for months, food scarcity was an ever-present threat. Viking farmers were reliant on the seasons to provide them with what they needed to survive, but the poor soil quality of the region meant that harvests could be meager, and crop failures were common. While some land offered a modest amount of fertile soil, much of the terrain was rocky and unyielding, making farming a challenge. Food could be unpredictable, and Vikings had to be resourceful in ensuring that they had enough to last them through the long winter months. They relied heavily on hunting, fishing, and livestock for their sustenance. The land, though harsh, did provide them with some bounty. Wild game, fish from the rivers and seas, and animals like cattle, goats, and pigs that could be raised for meat, milk, and wool. But even these resources were finite, and survival often came down to the careful management of the food they had. In preparation for the long winter, Food preservation methods were critical. Without refrigeration or the luxury of modern preservation techniques, the Vikings had to rely on salting, smoking, and drying their food to ensure that it would last. Fish and meats would be salted and smoked to preserve them for the months ahead. Grains would be carefully stored, and root vegetables, though scarce, were a valuable source of nutrition. The Vikings learned to make the most of whatever they had, finding ways to preserve food through methods passed down from generation to generation. But even these methods could be imperfect. A bad winter or a failed crop could mean that the food stores ran low. In such cases, survival depended on resourcefulness, hunting, fishing, and even trading with neighboring tribes or communities. The constant battle for food was not just about survival. It was about maintaining the strength and resilience needed to face the next challenge. There was a heavy reliance on salted meats, fish, and grains, which made up the bulk of the Viking diet. Fresh vegetables were rare, and fruits were a luxury that could only be enjoyed during the summer months. For the Vikings, every meal was a reminder of the limited resources they had, and the effort it took to gather and preserve food. It wasn't just about eating, it was about making every meal count, knowing that there was no guarantee of tomorrow's harvest. Living in such an environment meant that survival was never certain. The relentless cold, the scarcity of food, and the need to constantly be prepared for war shaped the very essence of Viking life. Each day was a battle not just against nature, but against time itself. The Vikings learned to adapt, to become resilient in the face of adversity. Their strength was not just physical, but mental. The ability to endure, to persevere, and to thrive in an unforgiving world. Every moment of Viking life, from gathering firewood to hunting game, was dictated by necessity. The homes they built, the food they ate, and the very rhythm of their daily lives reflected the harshness of their world. Survival was the ultimate goal, and everything else from personal comfort to leisure took a backseat to this one overriding concern. In this world there was no room for complacency. Life was harsh, but it was also shaped by the fierce drive to survive. And in surviving, the Vikings became not just warriors, but master survivors, a legacy that would echo through the annals of history. In the Viking world, there was no such thing as rest. Every day, from dawn until the last fading light of twilight, was a continuous grind of physical labor. The harsh winters left no reprieve for those living in the villages, as survival required constant attention to the needs of the household, the ships, and the farms. Even when the land was covered in snow and ice, there was still work to be done. The rhythm of Viking life was one of relentless activity, marked by both necessity and routine. The day began early. Before the sun had even risen, the Vikings would already be awake. The cold air of the morning would bite through the walls of the small homes, and with it came the immediate need to tend to the fire. Without the warmth of the hearth, survival was nearly impossible. The fire had to be kept burning, no matter the time of day or night, and this meant waking early to stoke the embers, ensuring there was enough fuel to last through the long hours of winter. Once the fire was tended to, there were animals to care for. The Vikings kept livestock, sheep, cattle, goats, and chickens, all of which needed feeding, cleaning, and sometimes milking. For the men, their day often began with the labor of herding or tending to the animals. But it was also a time to check traps, to gather firewood, and to repair any tools that had broken during the previous day's work. The cycle of tasks was ceaseless. There were no days off in the Viking world. Each day was about meeting the demands of survival, and that meant constant work, even during the bitter cold of winter. If you were a farmer, much of your labor would revolve around maintaining the fields. But in the short growing seasons, the time available to plant and harvest was limited, and the climate often made it difficult to grow enough food to see through the winter. In years of poor harvests, the Vikings would have to search for other sources of food. The family's food stores would consist largely of salted meat, dried fish, and grain, all of which were carefully preserved. But even this was not guaranteed. If the year's harvest failed, hunting, fishing, and foraging became essential. The land was unforgiving, and the harsh conditions meant that farming was no easy task. Soil in Scandinavia was thin and rocky, making it difficult to grow crops that would sustain a family through the entire year. A good crop might feed a family for a season, but even this was never certain. The Vikings had to rely on the bounty of the forests, rivers, and seas to supplement their meager harvests, gathering what they could from nature's limited offering. If the winters were too harsh, the search for food could become a desperate mission, pushing families to their limits. The women's work was no less demanding. Weaving, spinning wool, and making clothing for the family were essential tasks, carried out in the dim light of the home. The Vikings didn't have the luxury of store-bought goods. Every piece of clothing, every blanket, every tool was made by hand. The preparation for the coming winter, with its biting cold, required a tremendous amount of work. Clothes had to be mended, and fur pelts had to be tanned and stitched into coats that would protect against the cold. Meanwhile, the children helped with simpler tasks, or gathered what little firewood they could manage. But when it came to the preparation for raids, whether seasonal or in response to conflict, the workload into ships had to be maintained, weapons had to be sharpened, and training was continuous. A Viking warrior had to be ready for combat at any time, and that meant constant practice. Even those not directly involved in combat had to prepare, as the entire community often relied on the ability of its warriors to bring in wealth or protection. And with every raid came the possibility of loss, a reminder that the cycle of hard work could be undone in an instant. Each day in Viking life felt like a test, a challenge to see whether you could endure. The toil was never-ending, and the work often required physical strength, ingenuity, and resilience. There was little time for luxury or rest, for each season demanded its own tasks, and each failure meant that survival was less certain. The sea was both a source of wealth and a constant threat to the Vikings. While their longships were marvels of engineering, capable of traversing vast distances and carrying them across rough waters, the sea was unpredictable, unforgiving, and full of danger. The Vikings were a people whose lives were inextricably linked to the sea. It was their highway to conquest, trade, and exploration. Yet, it was also the place where many met their end. Viking longships were designed for speed and agility, built with sleek wooden hulls and shallow drafts that allowed them to navigate both open seas and shallow rivers. These ships enabled the Vikings to sail far from home, raiding the coasts of Britain, France, and even reaching as far as North America. But these same ships that carried them to distant lands were also exposed to the brutal forces of nature. The sea was not always kind. Storms could turn the calmest waters into treacherous waves, and the Vikings, without modern navigation tools, relied on rudimentary methods to find their way. They used landmarks, the position of the sun, and the stars to guide them. But navigation was many times, the ships would get caught in unexpected storms, buffeted by waves so high they seemed to swallow the boats whole. The Vikings had to rely on their skill and experience to survive such storms, often in complete darkness, with only the wind and the crashing of the waves to guide them. Even the most seasoned sailor could not predict the wrath of the ocean. The dangers of the sea were present at every turn. The Vikings understood that each journey could be their last. It wasn't uncommon for ships to be lost in storms, never to be seen again. The men aboard these ships, bound for raids or trade, often knew that the voyage would not necessarily be a one-way trip. The unpredictability of the sea meant that no Viking was ever truly safe. And yet, despite the risk, the sea was essential to Viking life. The coastal villages, especially in Norway and Denmark, depended on the sea for sustenance. Fishing was a vital source of food, and the Vikings were skilled fishermen who knew how to make the most of what the sea had to offer. The sea provided resources and routes for trading, connecting Viking societies with other cultures. In some ways, it was the lifeblood of their existence. The sea also offered a unique kind of opportunity for the Vikings. It was their route to wealth, allowing them to trade valuable goods such as furs, timber, and weapons. It was through their mastery of the sea that they could conquer and settle new lands, ensuring the growth of their kingdoms. But the same sea that provided them with these opportunities also took lives in exchange. It was a constant reminder that every gain came with the possibility of loss. In Viking society, the sea was both a provider and a grave. The mental toll of living on the sea was just as severe as the physical danger. Each voyage held the potential for disaster, and sailors had to remain vigilant at all times. They couldn't afford to let their guard down, for even the smallest mistake could cost them their lives. When men set out on a raid, it wasn't just the physical exhaustion of the journey they faced, it was the ever-present fear of the sea itself. In the end, the Vikings' relationship with the sea was one of both awe and fear. It was their way to wealth, power, and exploration, but it was also the very thing that could take everything from them. Their survival, much like their raids, was dependent on their mastery of the sea, but even the most skilled sailors could never escape the unpredictable forces of nature. In the Viking world, life was built around the ceaseless demands of labor, the unforgiving brutality of the sea, and the constant necessity for vigilance. Each day was a new challenge, and survival required constant effort. The Vikings' relationship with their environment, from the freezing winters to the vast and violent seas, shaped them into a people whose resilience became legendary. And in that resilience lay their ability to endure the harshest of circumstances year after year. The Viking raids, which have become synonymous with the era, are often romanticized in popular culture as thrilling stories of conquest, treasure, and glory. Yet, when we look closer, the reality of these raids was far grim. For the Vikings, raiding wasn't a sport or a mere quest for wealth. It was a matter of survival. Scandinavia, the homeland of the Vikings, was not a land of abundance. The soil was often thin and rocky, making agriculture difficult. The growing seasons were short, and in the harsh winters, crops could fail, leaving families vulnerable. The Vikings had to seek out other sources of sustenance to make it through these challenging conditions. This is where raiding came in, not merely as an act of plunder for glory, but as a necessity, driven by the dire need for food, resources, and fertile land. The Vikings, like any people, had a deep, almost instinctual drive to survive, and in the world they inhabited, raiding became an essential means of securing the food and supplies they could not grow at home. Coastal towns and monasteries, especially in Europe, became prime targets. These were places where wealth, food, stores, and even slaves could be found, often with little means of defense. Raids were not necessarily aimed at destruction for its own sake, but for acquisition. The Vikings brought home not just gold and silver, but also the food, livestock, and slaves that would help sustain their communities during the long winters. Each raid was a calculated necessity, where violence was a tool of survival rather than mere aggression. For the Viking warriors, these raids were not just about gaining wealth or prestige. They were often carried out by men who had no other choice but to fight. Many Vikings did not have the luxury of owning land. Their lives were shaped by the rugged, unyielding landscape they lived in, where survival depended on having enough resources to feed and clothe their families. And so, raiding became a way to acquire what was needed. This grim reality contrasts sharply with the romantic notion of Vikings as purely bloodthirsty marauders. For most, raiding was just another part of the struggle to stay alive. Though Viking raids are often portrayed as swift and victorious, the truth is far more brutal and exhausting. For every successful raid, there were countless others that ended in failure or retreat. The Vikings fought not only against their enemies, but also against exhaustion, hunger, and the endless uncertainties of warfare. Raids often involved long campaigns. These were not quick, glorified strikes, but extended periods of uncertainty. A Viking warrior would set out with his comrades, leaving behind his family in the hopes of returning with enough resources to last through the winter. But the success of these raids was never guaranteed. The Vikings faced many dangers, from storms at sea to armed resistance from well-fortified towns and monasteries. The constant uncertainty made every raid a gamble. Even successful raids could quickly turn to tragedy as warriors encountered unexpected challenges or were forced to return home without the spoils they had hoped for. The toll of these constant wars of attrition was heavy. Battles, while they may have been frequent, were grueling, exhausting affairs. Instead of the swift, decisive victories of legend, many Viking battles were long, drawn-out affairs marked by fear, confusion, and exhaustion. Many warriors fought not out of a sense of honor or glory, but out of a necessity to protect themselves, their families, and their communities. Success in one raid did not bring lasting relief, and by the time the next raid came, the warriors were often exhausted, their spirits worn down by the constant violence. Raids could last weeks or even months, with warriors often living in makeshift conditions, foraging for food and struggling to maintain their strength. Imagine the mental strain of constantly being at war, the fear of death always hanging over you. Every journey could be your last, and the brutality of the raids meant that many never returned home. For those who did, the scars, both physical and psychological, were often permanent. The Vikings were not simply warriors, they were survivors, and every raid was an attempt to stave off the constant threat of starvation and poverty. The exhaustion of repeated battles took its toll, and for many warriors, the glory of the raid faded quickly into the harsh reality of daily life. The physical toll of raiding was severe. The Vikings, known for their fearsome combat skills, often engaged in brutal hand-to-hand fighting, using axes, swords, and shields. These weapons, while effective, also left their mark on the warriors who wielded them. The scars from battles, the broken limbs, and the permanent injuries were a testament to the violence they endured. These wounds did not always heal properly, leaving many Vikings with lifelong. After a raid, when warriors returned home with their spoils, they often carried with them not just the wealth of the raid, but the physical and emotional cost of the violence. The toll of constant fighting meant that many of the warriors would struggle with the long-term effects of their injuries. Some would bear the scars of battle for the rest of their lives, not just the visible marks but the internal ones. The pain of old injuries, the fear of further conflict, the exhaustion of never knowing where the next fight would come. The threat of retaliation was another constant in Viking life. Raids were for every successful raid, there were enemies left behind, enemies who would seek revenge. The Vikings knew that every attack on another community would eventually lead to retaliation, and this threat was ever present. Neighboring tribes or kingdoms, sometimes even the very communities they had raided, would return in kind, leading to a constant state of conflict. Vengeance was a part of life in Viking society, and the line between right and wrong often blurred. The Vikings did not see their raids as acts of wanton destruction, but as necessary actions in a violent, unforgiving world. In this brutal existence, survival was often the only moral imperative, and everything else, including the consequences of violence, became secondary. Living in such a violent society meant that death was always on the horizon. Each raid, whether successful or not, could be the end for anyone involved. And even when a Viking survived a raid, the psychological weight of constant conflict took its toll. The Vikings lived in a world where violence was a constant companion, and this had deep, lasting effects on both the warriors who fought and the families they left behind. In Viking society, raiding was not a matter of glory, but of survival. It was driven by necessity, not greed, and shaped the very nature of the Viking people. The constant violence, the toll it took on the body and mind, and the ever-present fear of death or retaliation, made the Viking experience one of enduring hardship and struggle. The consequences of these raids, both physical and emotional, stayed with the Vikings long after the spoils of battle being distributed. Their lives were not defined by victory but by the ceaseless drive to survive in a world where violence was the only means of securing what they needed to live. Viking society was deeply rooted in a rigid social hierarchy. It was a society where one's place was largely determined by birth, strength, and, in some cases, luck. At the top of the social structure were the chieftains and kings, powerful leaders who controlled land, resources, and the lives of the people in their territories. Below them were the warriors, who fought for honor, wealth, and protection. Then came the farmers, craftsmen, and traders, the backbone of Viking society who worked the land, built the ships, and made the weapons necessary for survival. While there were distinctions between these groups, the reality for the common Viking was that survival came down to one's ability to contribute to the community. The class distinctions were clear, but Viking society, while hierarchical, was not as strictly bound as other ancient societies. The Vikings were a practical people, and their social structure could shift according to need. A warrior could rise to prominence through strength and success in battle, and a farmer could gain prestige by accumulating wealth or forging important alliances. But, regardless of how one climbed the social ladder, the harshness of Viking life meant that any rise in status was temporary at best. Power was constantly in flux. One of the most notable aspects of Viking society was the rigid division of gender roles. While women played an essential role in Viking society, their responsibilities were largely confined to domestic duties. Viking women were crucial to the household. They oversaw the running of the home, including weaving, cooking, and they also managed the livestock, which was vital for survival in a land where farming was difficult. Women were expected to be the caretakers, the glue that held the household together. But within this defined role, Viking women could still wield a degree of power, an influence, particularly in the absence of their husbands, who were often away on raids or in battle. Though women were rarely warriors, their roles were far from insignificant. In Viking society, women had significant responsibilities and rights that were rare in other contemporary cultures. They could own property, make decisions about marriage, and, if their husbands died, could take control of household affairs. However, they were still bound by the societal expectations of femininity. They were not warriors, and their primary purpose was centered around managing the domestic realm. Yet, there were exceptions. The shield maidens were rare and extraordinary figures who defied the usual gender roles of Viking society. These women fought alongside men in battle, earning their place in the sagas as legendary figures. Their existence, though inspiring, was more myth than reality for most Vikings. For the vast majority, women remained at home, tending to the hearth, while the men fought. But the notion of shield maidens shows that, in Viking society, there was space for deviation from the norm. If a woman was strong enough and capable enough, she might take up the sword and shield. But this was not the everyday experience for most women. In contrast to the relatively more defined roles of women, warriors had far more visible power, but even their status was uncertain. Warriors could rise to fame based on their prowess in battle, but they were also vulnerable to the capriciousness of Viking society. Even the mightiest warrior could fall from grace if a raid went wrong, if they lost favor with their chief, or if they became injured or too old to fight. Unlike the stability that came with farming or craftsmanship, the warrior class was one defined by uncertainty. Their fortunes could change with a single battle, and even a momentary lapse in fortune could lead to their downfall. While the Viking social structure was relatively flexible, it was also one defined by constant instability, particularly when it came to leadership. Chiefdoms and kingships were often fragile, and the Vikings lived in a world where leadership could change with startling suddenness. The highest authority in any Viking tribe or settlement was often the chief or king, but this role was never assured. The position was based on a combination of strength, charisma, and the ability to command loyalty. A leader had to maintain the support of both warriors and the community, and failure to do so meant the loss of power. The fear of betrayal was ever present in Viking leadership. The Vikings lived in a world where power was constantly shifting. Warlords rose and fell, and the strongest leaders often faced challenges from within their own ranks. A chief who lost favor could easily be replaced, not by democratic vote, but by force. Many Viking leaders secured their position through their ability to defend their community in battle or to acquire wealth through successful raids. However, these leaders had to keep their warriors satisfied and loyal, lest they be overthrown. Loyalty, in a world defined by frequent raids and battles, was often a tenuous thing. Viking society was also deeply tribal. These tribes were not united under a single king, but were instead often fragmented into competing factions. The leadership of one tribe could easily come into conflict with another, and this constant state of intertribal rivalry made stability difficult to achieve. Vikings could face the danger of betrayal not just from enemies, but from within their own ranks. For a Viking warrior, it was not just the external threats of the battlefield that made life uncertain, but the ever-present possibility that his own chief might be replaced, either through betrayal or by force. A chief's position was never guaranteed, and a warrior who supported the wrong leader could find himself in danger once the tides of power shifted. The Vikings were keenly aware of the transience of power. Even those with the highest status could face a fall from grace if they were unable to maintain the support of their followers. The threat of betrayal was especially pronounced in leadership. For those at the top, keeping your position meant constant vigilance, for even a single misstep could lead to loss of status, exile, or death. Moreover, the threat of betrayal didn't just apply to the leadership itself. Warriors also had to watch their backs. A Viking warrior's reputation and status were built on his ability to fight, but with this power came the fear of assassination or betrayal by fellow warriors. If a warrior gained too much influence or wealth, he might become the target of others who sought to undermine him or take his place. Even the greatest of Viking heroes could be betrayed by someone they trusted, as the fierce competition for power and prestige could easily turn into violent retribution. This constant uncertainty created an atmosphere of tension in Viking life. The fear of betrayal, especially among leaders, meant that even the most secure position could collapse in an instant. This unpredictability was compounded by the Vikings' constant exposure to violence and war. The shifting nature of Viking leadership mirrored the volatility of their world. It was a world where nothing, not even the highest position in society, was secure. The harshness of the Viking social hierarchy was not just about power and privilege, but about uncertainty. The Vikings lived in a world where everything could be upended at any moment. Gender roles, while strict, were flexible in some ways, and the social structure could shift, but there was always the threat of betrayal, the constant movement of power, and the fragile nature of leadership. To survive in this world, one had to navigate a constantly shifting landscape, where even the most powerful warriors and leaders could find themselves toppled by forces beyond their control. The Vikings were no strangers to this harsh reality, where the struggle for survival extended beyond the battlefield and into the very heart of their society. Warfare was the heartbeat of Viking life, a rhythm that pulsed through their existence from the moment they woke until the moment they slept. There was no peace, no respite from the relentless demands of battle. For the Vikings, war was not merely a period of their lives. Every year, every season, was marked by campaigns, raids, and skirmishes that defined the world in which they lived. From their earliest training to the moment they set foot in battle, the Vikings knew that their lives would be shaped by the sword, the shield, and the blood of war. The training for battle was unyielding. Every warrior was expected to be both strong and disciplined, learning the art of combat from a young age. From childhood, they were taught the ways of the sword, the spear, and the axe. Strength and skill were paramount, as the Vikings believed that a warrior's personal honor was intertwined with their prowess in battle. Every village and settlement relied on their warriors, not just to protect their land, but to bring back the spoils of raids, food, wealth, and resources essential for survival. These raids were not spontaneous affairs. Each one was meticulously planned, with warriors sharpening their weapons, fortifying their ships, and preparing themselves mentally and physically for the violence ahead. The weapons they carried were often extensions of themselves, swords and shields, each one crafted with care and skill, as they would be used not only to secure their survival but to protect their family and their community. The ship, too, was integral to the Vikings' warlike nature. Their longships, capable of traveling vast distances across seas and rivers, were the vehicles that carried the warriors into foreign lands, each raid a chance to gain treasure, resources, and perhaps glory. But for most Vikings, it was also a way to ensure that their people survived another harsh winter. When the time came to raid, the warriors would embark on long voyages, navigating by the stars, the sun, and the landmarks along the coastlines. Raids were violent affairs. Towns and villages were struck unexpectedly, and the Vikings, known for their swiftness and brutality, would rush in to take what they could. But raids weren't just about treasure. They were about securing the food, land, and slaves needed to sustain the Viking way of life. When raiding wasn't possible, there were still battles to be fought. Skirmishes with rival tribes, disputes over land, or conflicts with other groups for dominance. Each battle, no matter how small, left its mark not only on the land, but on the warriors who fought it. In this perpetual cycle of warfare, there were no breaks, no seasons of peace. Even when a Viking returned from a successful raid, he knew that the threat of another battle was never far behind. The land they sought to protect or conquer was always in flux. New threats, new enemies, and the need to assert their power through warfare. This unrelenting cycle of violence became ingrained in Viking society. Battles were not merely fought for the glory of the individual. They were fought for survival, to provide for the family and the village, to secure the next season's food, and to protect what was earned. While the physical toll of Viking warfare is often acknowledged, the psychological strain of living in a constant state of battle and readiness is rarely discussed. Imagine waking every day knowing that you might not survive the day's battle, that you might not return to your family, or that the next raid might be your last. The very nature of Viking raids left little room for mercy, and the psychological burden was immense. The Vikings did not fight for honor alone. They fought because it was the only way to secure their survival. The raids were brutal, with little time for reflection or remorse. For the warriors, fear and adrenaline became constant companions. The anticipation of battle, the fear of what lay ahead, the anxiety of not knowing if you would return, was an ever-present part of their psyche. Warriors had to steel themselves against the very real possibility of death, knowing that they could fall at any moment, whether through a strike from an enemy's blade, an ambush during a raid, or a misstep in a dangerous journey at sea. The possibility of death was not abstract. It was immediate, tangible, and likely. Imagine standing on the edge of a battlefield, your sword gripped tightly in your hand, your heart pounding in your chest. The sounds of battle echo around you, the clash of swords, the screams of fallen warriors, the roar of the wind. Your every move is calculated, each strike meant to protect yourself or secure a victory. But within this frenetic pace, there is always the lurking fear. Every Viking warrior had to confront the thought that the next strike could be their last. In this world of violence, there was no right time for death. There was only survival until survival was no longer possible. The psychological toll extended far beyond the battlefield. Each raid or skirmish, no matter the outcome, brought with it emotional scars. The fear that gripped the warriors before the fight could easily become a lingering presence, leaving traces of anxiety and tension long after the fight was over. And for those who survived, there was the haunting weight of the violence they had witnessed. A warrior might return home to his family, but the memories of battle, the faces of fallen comrades, the screams of dying enemies remained with him. In a society where showing emotions was often seen as a weakness, The Vikings were expected to carry their emotional burdens in silence. The effects of these experiences were not easily acknowledged, and the mental scars of warfare often went unspoken. The fear of death and the constant violence also took its toll on the warriors' sense of morality. Raiding was a necessary evil, and while Vikings may have believed they were justified in their actions, the line between right and wrong often blurred. Many warriors lived in a state of psychological dissonance, knowing that their actions were brutal but necessary. They justified their violence as a means of survival, yet this didn't make the psychological aftermath of battle any less painful. The Vikings, while fierce and unyielding on the outside, were often burdened by the knowledge that each raid left a trail of violence and destruction in its wake. The trauma of constant warfare did not just affect the warriors, it affected the society as a whole. Communities lived in a constant state of vigilance, with everyone aware of the possibility that a raid could strike at any moment, and when the warriors returned home, they carried with them not just the riches and spoils of battle, but the heavy weight of their experiences. In the Viking world, warfare was not just a way of life, it was survival. The constant need for resources, the drive to secure land, and the desire to protect one's community meant that battle was an ongoing necessity. Warriors fought not for personal glory but to ensure that they and their families could survive another year. The physical and psychological costs of this endless cycle were significant, leaving scars that lasted long after the battle was over. For the Vikings, war was not just about victory or conquest, it was about the struggle to endure in a world where violence was a constant, and death was always waiting just around the corner. The toll of warfare shaped every aspect of Viking life, from the warriors who fought to the families who waited for their return. Every battle had consequences, and every raid left its marks on the land and its people. The Vikings lived in a state of perpetual warfare, but in that struggle, they found the will to endure. Their resilience in the face of death, their determination to survive, and their ability to confront the constant fear of battle made them one of the most formidable peoples in history. But it also came at a price that each Viking warrior had to pay. As we step back and look at the tapestry of Viking life, it's clear that the relentless hardships they endured shaped not only their survival but their identity. The world of the Vikings, defined by unyielding winters, constant warfare, and a brutal social structure, was far from one of comfort or peace. It was a world where strength, resilience, and the ability to endure were the greatest currencies. Each day was a struggle, where the harshness of the environment, the constant threat of violence, and the daily grind of survival demanded that the Vikings live with a deep, unspoken tenacity. Survival, in Viking society, was not just about living another day, it was about enduring the hardships and challenges that came with every season. The harsh winters, the scarcity of food, the constant preparation for raids, the fear of betrayal, and the psychological toll of warfare created a cycle of struggle that the Vikings knew all too well. Their world was one where death could come swiftly, either by the sword, the sea, or the elements. But for the Vikings, this struggle was not something to be feared, it was simply a part of life. This constant struggle for survival created a unique resilience within Viking society. In the face of constant adversity, the Vikings learned to adapt. They became masters of resourcefulness, finding ways to extract what they needed from the harsh environment around them. The strength of their warriors was forged not just in battle, but in the very need to fight for resources, to carve out a place for themselves in a world that offered no favors. The longships, a symbol of Viking ingenuity, allowed them to travel vast distances, conquer new lands, and raid with unmatched speed and precision. Their ability to adapt to the challenges of nature and war helped them carve out a place in history that few other cultures could match. However, the cost of this resilience was high. The physical toll of constant raiding, the psychological strain of living in a perpetual state of war, and the inevitable loss of life in battle left scars that would last for generations. The Vikings, though strong, were not immune to suffering. Many warriors returned home to find themselves marked by the violence they had witnessed, broken bodies, lasting injuries, and the emotional toll of knowing that each raid brought them closer to death. The women, too, lived with the fear of loss, knowing that their husbands, sons, or fathers might not return from the next raid, and the constant threat of war meant that peace was a fleeting luxury, one that was hard to come by. Yet, despite the hardships, the Vikings were one of the most formidable and enduring societies of their time. Their ability to adapt, to fight, and to survive in such a hostile environment speaks to the incredible strength of their people. Their resilience became part of their identity. They were not just warriors, They were survivors, defined by their ability to withstand the harshest conditions and emerge victorious, if not in life, then at least in spirit. But this resilience was built on hardship and loss. Each Viking warrior who set out on a raid knew that he might not return. Every village lived under the shadow of potential attack. The land they fought for was harsh, and the rewards of battle often came with a high price. The Vikings were not just fighting for land or treasure, but for survival, for the chance to live another day, to continue the cycle, to protect their families, and to ensure their people endured. In the end, the Vikings' strength was both their greatest asset and their deepest burden. They built a society that lasted, but not without great sacrifice. They endured the brutality of their environment and the violence of their times, becoming a people defined by their ability to face hardship head-on. The legacy they left behind is not one of unbroken victory or untold wealth, but of a people who in the face of overwhelming odds carved out their place in history through sheer resilience, strength, and an unyielding will to survive. The Viking Age, spanning from the late 8th to the early 11th century, is one of the most fascinating and transformative periods in European history. It was a time defined by seafaring warriors, traders, and explorers from Scandinavia, the lands that would become Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. This era was marked by the Viking raids that struck fear into the hearts of European kingdoms, as well as the far-reaching voyages of exploration and settlement that reshaped the geography and cultures of Europe and beyond. The Vikings, driven by a mix of necessity and ambition, sought new lands for settlement, wealth, and resources. They famously targeted monasteries and coastal towns, plundering riches, enslaving people, and leaving their mark on history through their brutal raids. But the Vikings were more than just warriors. They were also skilled traders, shipbuilders, and navigators. Their longships, designed for both sea and river travel, allowed them to venture as far as North America, the Middle East, and North Africa. Among the most significant figures of this period was Ragnar Lothbrok, a man whose name would become synonymous with Viking prowess, not just in battle but in leadership, exploration, and adventure. Ragnar, whether as a historical figure or as a legendary one, embodied the essence of the Viking spirit, fearless and determined to expand his world. His life and exploits have become a symbol of the Viking Age, shaping the way we view this era of seafaring and conquest. The historical accuracy of Ragnar Lothbrok's life is shrouded in mystery, as much of what we know about him comes from the sagas, poetic accounts written down centuries after the events they describe. These sagas blend history with myth, mixing real events with embellishments, exaggerations, and outright fiction. As a result, the line between Ragnar the man and Ragnar the myth is often blurred. What is certain, however, is that Ragnar's name has endured in the annals of Viking lore. He is celebrated as one of the greatest Viking kings, known for his daring raids and extraordinary feats. Yet, much of what we know about Ragnar is wrapped in the colorful fabric of saga storytelling. The sagas themselves were not written for historical accuracy, but as a means of preserving the values, traditions, and culture of the Vikings. There were stories designed to entertain, inspire, and remind the Vikings of their collective identity. As a result, it's unclear exactly how much of Ragnar's life is based in historical fact. Did he truly raid Paris in the 9th century as described, or is that a later embellishment? Did he die in a pit of snakes, as the sagas suggest, or was his end more mundane? These questions remain unanswered, leaving us with a figure who exists somewhere between fact and legend. Regardless of the exact truth of Ragnar's life, one thing is clear: he embodies the Viking hero archetype. Ragnar is more than just a historical figure. He is a symbol of the ideal Viking, a leader, warrior, and adventurer who pushed the boundaries of his society. Like many Viking heroes, he was driven by a desire for fame, fortune, and the approval of the gods. But Ragnar's legacy also lies in the way he personified the values that defined Viking society: courage, loyalty, and an unyielding spirit. The Viking hero, as exemplified by Ragnar, was someone who lived by the sword, but also recognized the importance of leadership. Ragnar was not just a warrior who fought for wealth or glory. He was a man who understood that true power came from leading others, from protecting his people, and from forging alliances. His raids were not just about conquest, they were also about survival, expanding the reach of his people and ensuring their place in the world. What set Ragnar apart was not only his physical prowess, but his ability to inspire others. Like many Viking heroes, he was a figure who transcended his time, becoming larger than life. The sagas tell of his extraordinary feats, his clever tactics in battle, his leadership in the face of adversity, and his enduring legacy as a king and warrior. But they also highlight his human side, his struggles with loyalty, his love for his family, and the sacrifices he made in the pursuit of power and honor. In many ways, Ragnar Lothbrok became the embodiment of what it meant to be a Viking. His life was a blend of personal valor and communal sacrifice, qualities that every Viking warrior aspired to. His story, whether true or embellished, continues to inspire those who seek to understand the values of the Viking Age, an age defined by a relentless pursuit of survival, glory, and the unknown. Thus, Ragnar Lothbrok, in both myth and reality, stands as a towering figure of the Viking Age. His legacy, shaped by both his legendary deeds and the historical realities of the Viking world, continues to captivate our imaginations. Whether as a real king or a mythical hero, Ragnar remains a symbol of the indomitable spirit that defined the Vikings, warriors who lived on the edge of the known world, where survival was never certain, but courage and strength were the only guarantees. The early life of Ragnar Lothbrok is shrouded in the mists of legend, and as with many historical figures whose stories have been passed down through the ages, the line between fact and myth is often difficult to discern. According to the sagas, Ragnar was born into a noble or royal family, with some accounts suggesting that he was the son of a great warrior or chieftain, possibly even a king. The sagas paint him as the son of the legendary Sigurd Ring, a famed warrior king of the Swedes, though some versions of the myth suggest his father's identity is less clear. The claim that Ragnar was of royal blood would have been a significant part of his identity, giving him the ambition and drive to carve out a name for himself as both a leader and a warrior. The nature of Ragnar's early life, as recounted in the sagas, presents him as coming from humble beginnings, despite his noble lineage. This combination of royal heritage and the drive to prove himself suggests a complicated relationship with his status. He was likely raised with an understanding of the values and responsibilities associated with leadership, but also with the harsh realities of the Viking world, a world in which survival and success depended on strength, cunning, and the ability to command loyalty. From the outset, Ragnar's destiny seemed tied to the fierce world of Viking raiding and warfare. While some versions of the story describe him as the son of royalty, other accounts present Ragnar as an adventurous youth, seeking to make a name for himself far from the safety of the royal halls. This sense of yearning to prove his worth and gain honor in battle would go on to define much of his life. Viking youth were often trained in the arts of warfare from an early age. From the time Ragnar could wield a sword, he would have been taught the skills needed for battle, not just to protect his community but to claim a place among the greatest warriors of his time. This education in combat was not limited to physical training, but also included learning how to navigate the seas, how to lead men in battle, and how to build alliances and make decisions in the heat of conflict. In the early years of Ragnar's life, his training would have focused on the basic elements of survival and combat. Viking warriors needed to be masters of both offense and defense, skilled with weapons such as the axe, spear, sword, and shield. As Ragnar grew older, his training would have expanded to more advanced strategies in warfare and leadership. His ability to command a crew of men in battle would have set him apart from other warriors, as Viking society valued not just individual combat prowess, but also the ability to lead and inspire those around you. Ragnar's initiation into battle would have been a defining moment in his life. The first experiences of bloodshed, fear, and survival would have molded him into the warrior he became. Imagine Ragnar, still young but already in the thick of battle, fighting alongside seasoned warriors. The roar of battle would be deafening, the clash of metal, the cries of warriors, and the pounding of feet as men charged into the fray. For a young man like Ragnar, this would have been both exhilarating and terrifying. The first lesson of war, one that every Viking warrior learned, was that survival required more than strength. It required grit, resourcefulness, and the ability to think under pressure. Ragnar's first taste of battle would have forced him to confront the true nature of violence, where victory was uncertain, and the consequences of failure were severe. Early raids as Ragnar's skills grew, so too did his thirst for adventure and glory. His first expeditions, according to the sagas, were likely small raids on nearby coastal settlements, the kind of lightning-fast strikes that were the hallmark of Viking warfare. These raids were not just about treasure, they were about proving oneself and gaining the resources needed for survival. For Ragnar, these early raids would have been a trial by fire, testing not only his combat skills, but also his ability to lead and inspire others. The challenges faced on these early raids were numerous. The Vikings depended on their longships to navigate the seas, but even the best ships were vulnerable to storms and the unpredictable nature of the seas. Moreover, Viking raids were often against well-established, fortified settlements, where the defenders were better equipped and more numerous. To succeed, Ragnar would have had to master the art of warfare, both on land and sea. The raids also required a strong sense of strategy and adaptability, as battles were often unpredictable and could turn in an instant. Ragnar's early successes on these raids would have been key to his rise to prominence. It was through these early battles that he proved himself as a warrior of exceptional skill and leadership. The sagas describe Ragnar as a man who led with both force and cunning, using unconventional tactics and brilliant strategies to win battles. As his reputation grew, so did his following. The young warrior who had once sailed with a small crew on limited raids now began to gather a larger band of loyal men, all eager to fight under his banner. What set Ragnar apart from others, however, was his ability to inspire loyalty. While many Viking chieftains and warriors were feared for their strength, Ragnar's followers admired him for his sense of justice, his charisma, and his courage. He was not just a king or leader, he was someone they respected and believed in. His early raids were not just about gaining wealth, but about gaining the respect of his peers and securing his place in Viking society. Through his actions, Ragnar laid the foundation for what would become a legendary career as a warrior and leader. Ragnar's rise to prominence was driven by several motivations, each intertwined with the harsh realities of Viking life. At the heart of his ambition was the desire for glory, a characteristic trait of Viking warriors. The Vikings lived in a world where reputation was everything. In a society defined by constant warfare, raiding, and conquest, honor and personal glory were earned on the battlefield. The sagas tell us that Ragnar sought not just wealth, but eternal fame, hoping his name would be remembered long after his death. However, Ragnar's desire for personal glory was not born from mere vanity. It was tied to a deeper need to provide for his people and family. Vikings, especially those in positions of leadership, often viewed their role as more than just warriors. They saw themselves as protectors of their clans. In a world where food was scarce and survival was never guaranteed, raiding was a way to ensure the future of one's family and followers. Ragnar, despite his desire for renown, would have been keenly aware that his ability to provide resources and security was as important as any battle he fought. Moreover, Ragnar's quest for glory was also spiritual in nature. Like many Vikings, Ragnar sought to prove himself worthy in the eyes of the gods. The Viking gods were central to their worldview, and glory in battle was seen as a direct way to earn favor with them. The desire to be remembered as a hero, a man of valor who had fought and won for the greater good, was tied deeply to the belief in an afterlife, a life in Valhalla for those who were brave and worthy. The prospect of eternal glory in the halls of Odin was a powerful motivator for Ragnar and many others like him. But despite his fame and success, the true motivation behind Ragnar's rise was always tied to the need for survival. As he began to gain more followers and increase his wealth, Ragnar understood that power was fleeting. He sought not just fame, but the security that came with it. For himself, his family, and his people. His raids, though often framed as acts of personal glory, were also acts of survival. Every victory, every conquest, every new land was a step toward ensuring that the Viking way of life would continue. In the early chapters of his life, Ragnar Lothbrok embodied all the contradictions of Viking society, the drive to survive, and the need to lead. His early experiences shaped him into the warrior and leader who would later conquer kingdoms and become a legend. His rise to prominence was not merely the result of talent in battle, but also his ability to inspire loyalty, navigate the complexities of Viking society, and fulfill the deeper, communal needs of his people. In the summer of 800, one of the most iconic events in Viking history took place. A raid on the heart of the Frankish kingdom, Paris, led by the legendary Ragnar Loth. The raid is often remembered for its daring nature and its devastating impact on the city. But beneath the surface of the saga lies a story of strategic genius, careful planning, and a calculated approach to warfare. Ragnar's fleet, a formidable armada of Viking longships, set sail from their homeland in Scandinavia, navigating the stormy seas and rivers of northern Europe. These ships were not just vessels of war. They were masterpieces of Viking engineering, designed for both speed and maneuverability. The longships could traverse both open waters and shallow rivers, a distinct advantage that allowed Ragnar's forces to strike swiftly and unexpectedly. The shipbuilders had crafted these vessels to withstand rough seas and navigate narrow riverways, making it possible for Ragnar to sail up the river Seine deep into the Frankish heartland. The raid was as much about surprise as it was about power. Ragnar knew that the element of surprise would give him the upper hand. By sailing up the Seine, avoiding the heavily fortified city gates, and attacking the heart of the Frankish kingdom from the river, he caught the defenders off guard. The Franks had already been aware of Viking raids along the northern coast, but a direct strike on Paris was something they had not anticipated. Ragnar had studied the geography, the river systems, and the city's defenses in meticulous detail. His fleet, moving swiftly and silently, made its way toward Paris, knowing that once they reached the city, they would have to move quickly and decisively. The Vikings arrived at Paris, and what followed was a siege that would push both sides to their limits. Paris, at the time, was a powerful fortress city that sat on an island in the middle of the river Seine, surrounded by high walls and protected by the formidable Frankish army. The city appeared to be an impenetrable stronghold. The Frankish defenders, led by the Frankish king Charles the Bald, were well aware of the Viking threat. But even they were shocked by the audacity and speed with which Ragnar had struck. As the Vikings anchored their longships along the banks of the Seine, the tension in Paris thickened. The sounds of the river flowing beneath the ships, the cries of the warriors preparing for battle, and the low murmur of anxious conversation filled the air. On the shore, Ragnar's warriors, battle-hardened and accustomed to the brutality of warfare, began preparing for the siege. They were not just fighting for riches or land. They were fighting for the survival of their people, for the very future of their clan. The stakes could not have been higher. Ragnar's tactical genius became evident as the siege unfolded. The Vikings used their ships to their advantage, positioning them strategically along the river and using them to block any escape routes for the defenders. They launched frequent raids against the walls, using their superior mobility to move quickly between attacks. Ragnar's warriors, armed with axes and swords, attacked the gates and outer walls, while others would climb the ramparts to break through the defenders' lines. The sound of metal clashing against metal, the thunderous booms of siege weapons, and the screams of combat filled the air. Despite the formidable defenses, the Vikings pushed forward, using their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. The siege lasted for several days. Ragnar and his warriors knew that time was of the essence. They had to break the city's resolve quickly, as they could not afford to get bogged down in a protracted siege. Ragnar's ability to rally his men during these stressful moments was a testament to his leadership. He was not only a skilled warrior, but a leader who understood the psychological toll of war. His warriors followed him not just because of his strength, but because they believed in his vision and trust in his leadership. But the Frankish defenders, while caught off guard, were not without their own courage and resolve. The defenders mounted a fierce resistance, sending arrows and boiling oil from the walls, attempting to keep the Viking warriors at bay. Paris, though under siege, remained a fortress of defiance. But Ragnar's tactics, his ability to strike fast, adapt, and exploit weaknesses, eventually wore down the defenders' morale. Ragnar's raid on Paris was not just a military victory. It was a game-changer that would forever cement his reputation as one of the greatest Viking leaders of all time. The scale of the raid, the audacity of striking the heart of the Frankish kingdom, and the brutal efficiency of the siege made Ragnar's name synonymous with Viking dominance. His reputation spread throughout the Viking world. His warriors returned home with tales of their conquests, and Ragnar became a legend. This raid was also significant because it marked a turning point in Viking history. It demonstrated that the Vikings were not just raiders, they were formidable military tacticians capable of challenging the greatest kingdoms of Europe. Ragnar's victory was not simply a matter of brute strength. It was the product of careful planning, strategic insight, and an understanding of the value of shock tactics. He proved that the Vikings were a force to be reckoned with, capable of breaking through even the most formidable defenses. The cultural significance of this raid cannot be overstated. For the Vikings, success in battle was not just about wealth or territory. It was about honor and glory. Ragnar's success at Paris became a symbol of Viking strength and cunning, a legacy that would inspire generations of warriors. For the Franks, the raid was a humiliation, a reminder of their vulnerability to the Viking onslaught. This was a victory not just for Ragnar, but for the entire Viking way of life, a reminder that, in their world, the gods favored the bold and the brave. While Ragnar's victory at Paris was immense, it came with a heavy cost. As with many great battles, The consequences of such a raid were not just measured in the treasure and glory won, but in the physical and psychological toll it took on Ragnar and his warriors. Despite the riches they brought home, the losses were significant. Many Viking warriors perished in the siege, either in battle or due to the harsh conditions of the campaign. For Ragnar, the cost of his victory was not just in lost men, but in the wear and tear on his body and spirit. War, for all its glory, left its scars. The exhaustion of the siege, the brutal combat, and the constant threat of death weighed heavily on Ragnar. In the sagas, Ragnar is often portrayed as a larger-than-life figure, but even legends bear the marks of their struggles. The aftermath of the raid, the funerals, the wounded warriors, the endless rebuilding would have been a stark reminder that the price of war was always high. Moreover, the toll of war did not end with the raid. The fear of retaliation was a constant presence. The Franks, humiliated by the fall of Paris, would eventually seek revenge. The cycle of violence, raids, and counter-raids would continue, each side pushing the other to greater extremes. Ragnar's victory at Paris may have been celebrated as one of the greatest raids in Viking history, but the cost of future retaliation and the continuous need for defense would only add to the ongoing burden of warfare. In the end, Ragnar's raid on Paris exemplified the dual nature of Viking conquests, the glory of victory, tempered by the toll of loss, fear, and unrelenting violence. It was a campaign that defined his legacy, but also reminded Ragnar and his warriors that the world they inhabited was one where survival and conquest came at a price. Ragnar Lothbrake's raid on Paris was a monumental moment in Viking history, a brilliant blend of strategy, courage, and audacity. But beneath the glory, the victory came at great cost. The toll on Ragnar's warriors, the physical scars of battle, and the cycle of vengeance that followed are all part of the complex tapestry of Viking life. Ragnar's success, while immense, serves as a reminder that, in the world of the Vikings, glory and struggle were inseparable, and even the greatest of warriors had to pay the price for their fame. Ragnar Lothbrake's life, both as a warrior and a king, was intricately woven with the threads of his relationships, particularly with his two prominent wives, Lagertha and Aslaug, and the legacy they helped shape. These relationships were more than mere marriages. They were political alliances and partnerships in the truest sense, helping to consolidate Ragnar's power, secure alliances, and ultimately play a significant role in his legacy. However, they were also deeply personal, reflecting the Viking ethos of loyalty, love, and duty. Lagertha, the first of Ragnar's wives, was a woman who fought beside him in battle and shared the hardships of Viking life. Their relationship, as described in the sagas, was one of mutual respect and admiration. Lagertha was not just a companion, she was a partner in war. She fought with the same ferocity as Ragnar, and her presence in his life symbolized the strength and resilience of the Viking spirit. However, despite their shared warrior ethos, their marriage was fraught with tensions. Ragnar, driven by ambition and the pursuit of greater power, eventually left Lagertha to marry Aslaug. While Lagertha's departure from Ragnar's life was marked by a sense of betrayal, their bond remained significant, as Lagertha later went on to play a vital role in protecting her family. Aslaug, on the other hand, was a more mystical and enigmatic figure. She was a princess and a seeress with a powerful connection to the gods. When Ragnar met her, he was immediately struck by her beauty and wisdom. Their marriage was not just a personal connection, but a union that elevated Ragnar's position, both politically and spiritually. Aslaug's role in Ragnar's life was less about battle and more about prophecy and the deep connections to the divine. She bore Ragnar several sons, each of whom would go on to play pivotal roles in Viking history. Both Lagertha and Aslaug contributed to the cultural and political fabric of Ragnar's life, with Lagertha embodying the warrioress spirit and Aslaug representing the divine and royal aspects of Ragnar's ambitions. Their relationship shaped the path Ragnar would take, influencing his decisions and actions in both the personal and political spheres. The children's role in his saga, Ragnar's sons, the products of his unions with Lagertha, were integral to his saga, both during his life and after his death. These sons, Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn, Ironside, Sigurd Snek, Indi, and Ub, were not just Ragnar's heirs, but also formidable warriors in their own right, each carving out their place in Viking history. Ivar, known for his tactical brilliance and cruelty, became the leader of the great heathen army and led the charge into England. His name would forever be linked with vengeance, as he sought to avenge his father's death at the hands of the Northumbrian king, Bjorn. The eldest son, became a legendary explorer, pushing the boundaries of the Viking world into the Mediterranean and beyond. Sigurd, known for his distinctive snake-shaped birthmark, became a renowned warrior in his own right, and carried on the Viking legacy of exploration and conquest. The legacy of Ragnar's sons was not only one of military conquest, but of leadership and dynastic ambition. Through his sons, Ragnar's name would continue to echo through the Viking world. His children did not just inherit his throne but expanded it, creating a powerful dynasty that carried on his name long after his death. Their involvement in the Viking raids and campaigns helped solidify Ragnar's reputation as not just a great warrior but a figure whose legacy extended through his bloodline. In the sagas, Ragnar's relationship with his sons is often depicted as one of mutual respect, but also marked by the complexities of Viking family life. Ragnar raised his sons to be strong, independent warriors, and while they were his legacy, they also became symbols of his personal sacrifice. Ragnar's ambition, his desire to conquer new lands and secure his place in history, meant that his sons were sometimes left to follow in his footsteps, even if it meant facing their own battles and challenges, internal struggles and personal sacrifice. While Ragnar's life was marked by countless victories and moments of glory, it was also a life of internal struggles and personal sacrifice. As a father, husband, and king, Ragnar faced the constant tension between duty and desire, between the needs of his family and the demands of conquest. His desire to lead, to conquer, and to ensure the survival of his people often conflicted with his personal relationships, particularly with his wives and children. Ragnar's ambition drove him to leave Lagertha, a woman who had fought beside him, for Aslaug, a woman who promised him not only love, but also the prophecy of a greater destiny. His pursuit of power and glory often came at the cost of his personal relationships, leaving behind emotional scars. Ragnar's ambition led him to prioritize war and conquest over domestic life, which left his wives and children in a constant state of uncertainty and emotional strain. He was a king who was forever driven by the need to expand his reach. But at what cost? His emotional detachment from his family, though necessary in the brutal world of the Viking, created a paradox. The very legacy he sought to build often came at the expense of his personal connections. As a father, Ragnar had to make difficult choices that would affect his children's future. His sons were raised with the knowledge that they were destined for greatness, but also that the path to greatness was fraught with danger. His children, especially his sons, grew up in an environment where warfare and conquest were the central pillars of existence. Ragnar's internal conflict lay in the fact that he wanted to secure the future of his family, but he knew that this often meant leaving them behind, facing the emotional toll of his decisions. He sought not just power, but immortality through his children, understanding that his legacy would only be sustained by their actions. Reflection on Viking family life. Viking family life was deeply intertwined with the hardships of survival and the imperatives of conquest. The concept of family duty was fundamental to Viking society. A Viking's role as a husband, father, and leader was not just about domestic responsibilities, but about maintaining the family's honor and legacy through warfare and conquest. Ragnar's personal life mirrored this tension between domestic roles and the need for military ambition. His desire to expand his territory and secure his place in history often took precedence over the emotional needs of his family. In the Viking world, the boundaries between personal and public life were blurred. The men went off to war, leaving behind their families, who had to shoulder the responsibility of managing the household and keeping the community together. The families of warriors understood that warfare was essential not only for survival, but for maintaining the family's honor and prestige. Ragnar's wives and children, particularly Lagertha, understood their role in this dynamic, where loyalty to the warrior king was paramount, but the emotional toll of war and separation was ever present. Ragnar, in his pursuit of glory, often had to reconcile his personal desires with the demands of his public life. He was a king and a warrior, but he was also a father and a husband, roles that pulled him in conflicting directions. In the end, Ragnar's personal struggles reflect the broader conflict at the heart of Viking society, the tension between honor, duty, and family. Despite the grand exploits and heroic battles, the life of Ragnar Lothbrok was one of sacrifice, not just on the battlefield but in the emotional cost of his choices, which would echo through his family and the generations to come. Ragnar Lothbrok's life was not just marked by military conquest, but by the complex relationships that shaped his legacy. His marriages, his children, and his internal struggles all played a role in creating the man whose name would be remembered for centuries. His personal sacrifices, both as a king and a father, reflect the deeper, often unspoken cost of the Viking way of life, where family, loyalty, and ambition were forever intertwined in a world defined by war and survival. The fall of Ragnar Lothbrok marks a pivotal and tragic moment in Viking history, a dramatic and bitter end to the life of one of the most legendary figures of the Viking Age. His capture by King El of Northumbria is often seen as a consequence of both betrayal and the fragility of Viking alliances. In the world of the Vikings, loyalty was not guaranteed. Alliances were often forged in blood, but they could dissolve just as quickly, particularly when personal ambition or opportunity arose. Ragnar's capture is a reflection of the political landscape in which even the mightiest warrior could find himself vulnerable to treachery. Ragnar, despite his earlier conquests and the fearsome reputation he had built, was no stranger to the unpredictable nature of Viking politics. As a chieftain and warrior, Ragnar had built relationships with various Viking leaders, tribes, and kingdoms. However, such alliances were always precarious. Power in the Viking world was never static. It was always in flux, shaped by shifting loyalties, rivalries, and the constant struggle for dominance. Ragnar's alliances were crucial to his successes, but they were also subject to the whims of other powerful leaders. It is believed that Ragnar's betrayal came from one of his own, a former ally who, for reasons both personal and political, decided to hand him over to King El. Betrayal in Viking society was often a harsh reality. Viking leaders and warriors lived in a world where personal ambition could easily supersede loyalty, and the price of betrayal was often death. The reasons behind Ragnar's betrayal remain speculative, but it is clear that ambition, the desire for power, and a quest for personal gain were likely central to the motives of those who turned against him. As Ragnar found himself captured by Eäl's forces, the brutal realities of Viking political life were exposed. While Ragnar had once led raids with an iron fist, his fate now lay in the hands of an enemy king. The capture was a crushing blow, not just to Ragnar personally, but to his followers, who knew that even their greatest leader could fall. The tragic irony of Ragnar's capture was that, despite all of his cunning, strength, and strategic genius, it was the ever-shifting tides of Viking politics and the vulnerability of his alliances that ultimately led to his downfall. Ragnar's death in the Pit of Snakes is one of the most legendary and haunting moments in Viking history. While the historical accuracy of this event is debated, the imagery of Ragnar's death has come to symbolize the brutal and unforgiving nature of Viking life. A life where even the greatest of warriors met their end in the most savage of circumstances. According to the sagas, after being captured by El, Ragnar was sentenced to death in one of the most horrific ways imaginable. He was thrown into a pit of snakes. The cold, damp air of the pit would have pressed against Ragnar's skin as he fell into the darkened hole, surrounded by venomous serpents. The sound of hissing and the slithering of the snakes would have filled the space, creating a terrifying atmosphere. The sharp, frightening sting of the snakes as they coiled around him and struck at his body would have been agonizing. The venom would course through his veins, and death would have been inevitable. Yet Ragnar's final moments were marked by more than just physical pain. In the sagas, Ragnar's response to his death was profound. He is said to have faced his end with courage and stoic acceptance. Even as he was being slowly killed by the snakes, Ragnar's voice rang out, taunting his captors. How the little pigs would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers, he famously said, referring to his sons and the vengeance they would exact on El. This final act, confronting death with both defiance and pride, encapsulated the essence of Viking warrior culture. For Ragnar, death was not a retreat, but an inevitable end, one that he would face as bravely as he had lived. The symbolic nature of Ragnar's death is powerful. The snake pit represented the very worst of Viking fate, a slow, torturous death that mirrored the violence and unpredictability of the world Ragnar had fought to survive. It was not a battle, but a gruesome endgame for a man who had spent his life waging war, both on land and at sea. The imagery of the snakes, creatures that slither in the shadows and strike without warning, also highlights the constant threat of death that loomed over Viking society. It was fitting that Ragnar, a man who had lived by the sword, should meet his death in such a brutal, symbolic manner. His end came from the same world that had shaped his life, violent, unforgiving, and ever-present. Ragnar's legacy, in his death, Ragnar's death, though tragic and violent, marked the end of an era in Viking history. It signified the close of a chapter for the legendary war, but it also set the stage for the next great chapter in the saga of Viking expansion and conquest. While Ragnar's life had been defined by his raids, his tactical brilliance, and his unyielding spirit, it was his death that would launch his legacy into even greater mythological proportions. Ragnar's sons, Ivar, the Boneless, Bjorn, Ironside, Sigurd, and Obi would go on to avenge his death, continuing his war against the Franks and other kingdoms. It was through this act of vengeance that Ragnar's legacy truly solidified. The great heathen army, led by Ivar, invaded England and avenged Ragnar's death, fulfilling Ragnar's final wish that his sons would be the ones to bring justice for his capture and murder. In this way, Ragnar's death fueled the ongoing cycle of Viking vengeance and glory. Ragnar's death was also a symbol of the Viking ethos. He had lived a life of constant battle, of constant risk and sacrifice, and his final moments reflected the ultimate truth of the Viking world, that death was always near, and it came without mercy. Yet, even in death, Ragnar's spirit lived on, immortalized by the acts of his sons and the legacy he had created. His saga was not merely about the victories he won, but about the enduring impact he had on Viking society, and how his bloodline carried on the wars and conquests he had initiated. The symbolic nature of his death, Ragnar Lothbrek's death, became a powerful symbol of the Viking ethos, one that combined the inevitable brutality of Viking warfare with the unbreakable resilience of the Viking spirit. His death was a metaphor for the harshness of Viking existence. To die in battle, to die in the hands of your enemies, or to face death in such a savage manner was not unusual for the Vikings. What made Ragnar's death stand out was not just the manner of his end, but the way in which he faced it. Ragnar's death became a lesson in bravery, resilience, and defiance, qualities that defined Viking warriors. The symbolic nature of Ragnar's death lay in the way it encapsulated the tension between life and death, a tension that was ever present in the Viking world. To be a Viking was to live with the awareness that death could come at any moment, whether from the sword, the sea, or the elements. Ragnar, in his final moments, showed that true Viking strength lay not just in the ability to fight and conquer, but in the ability to face death with courage and defiance. In this way, Ragnar's death did not mark the end of his saga, but rather the beginning of a new chapter, one of vengeance, glory, and continued conquest. His legacy was not just about the battles he fought, but about the lasting impact he left on his sons, on his people, and on the Viking world that would follow. Ragnar's death, while tragic and brutal, became a testament to the enduring nature of the Viking spirit, one that would never yield, even in the face of certain death. Ragnar Lothbrek's name has transcended the pages of history, becoming a central figure in the sagas that have immortalized him. While Ragnar's life was filled with both glory and tragedy, it was through the sagas that his legend was shaped, embellished, and passed down from generation to generation. These stories, though filled with poetic flourishes and dramatic embellishments, contained the core elements of what it meant to be a Viking hero: bravery, leadership, and sacrifice. The sagas, written centuries after Ragnar's death, were far more than mere accounts of historical events. They were instruments of cultural transmission. They were stories meant to inspire, educate, and instill values in the young generations of Vikings. The language of the sagas, with its rhythmic cadence and vivid imagery, brought Ragnar's adventures to life. These tales of raids, victories, and betrayals were designed to preserve the Viking ethos, a worldview that prized courage, honor, and resilience. At the heart of these sagas was not just the physical battles Ragnar fought, but the internal struggles that defined him as a leader and a man. His rise from a humble warrior to a king, his victories and defeats, and ultimately, his tragic death were woven into a narrative that reflected the reality of Viking life, one that was defined by constant struggle, honor, and inevitable loss. Ragnar's story became a symbol of the Viking ideal, encapsulating the qualities that Vikings held dear. These sagas, passed down by word of mouth before being transcribed into written form, ensured that Ragnar's legacy would never be forgotten, shaping Viking culture for centuries to come. Even today, Ragnar's story continues to influence modern perceptions of the Vikings. His legendary status has been cemented not just in historical texts but in popular culture as well. From television shows to books, Ragnar remains a central figure in the way we view Viking society. His name evokes images of adventurous seafaring, brutal combat, and heroic leadership. Yet beneath this glorified exterior, the sagas remind us of the harsh realities of Viking life. that every victory was fought at great cost, and that even the greatest warriors could be undone by fate or betrayal. Ragnar's true legacy, however, did not end with his death. His sons, Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn, Ironside, Sigurd, and carried forward his name and his ambitions, each leaving his own mark on the Viking world. As with their father, the stories of Ragnar's sons became part of the Viking saga, celebrated for their courage, military prowess, and the continuing cycle of conquest and revenge. Ivar the Boneless, the most notorious of Ragnar's sons, became known for his cruelty and strategic genius. Following Ragnar's death, Ivar led the great heathen army into England, where he would go on to wreak havoc, eventually avenging his father's death by killing King El in the same brutal manner Ragnar had died. His story, marked by ruthlessness and tactical brilliance, ensured that Ragnar's bloodline would continue to strike fear into the hearts of their enemies. Bjorn Ironside, Ragnar's eldest son, ventured into the Mediterranean, forging his own path of exploration and conquest. His voyages took him far beyond the traditional Viking raiding grounds, expanding the reach of the Vikings to lands that had previously been beyond their grasp. Unlike Ivar, Bjorn's legacy was defined not just by his military might, but also by his exploratory spirit, helping to reshape the understanding of the Viking world. Sigurd, Snake, and Inob also played pivotal roles in Viking history, each contributing to the Viking campaigns across Europe and beyond. Together, these sons carried forward Ragnar's warlike legacy, building on the foundation he had laid and expanding their family's influence. But despite their individual paths, the unity of the brothers and the shared mission of avenging their father continued to define their saga. As Ragnar's sons grew into warriors in their own right, they continued the cycle of vengeance that had begun with his death. Their exploits across England, France, and Scandinavia solidified the Viking presence in Europe, ensuring that Ragnar's legacy would endure long after his death. In many ways, Ragnar's death became a catalyst for the further expansion of Viking influence. As his sons carried his spirit into the next generation of raids and conquests, the cultural impact of Ragnar's story, Ragnar Lothbrok's impact on Viking culture, is undeniable. His legacy was not just one of conquest, but of symbolism and cultural identity. He became the archetype of the Viking hero, a man whose qualities, cunning, bravery, and ambition, embodied the values the Vikings held dear. As a leader, Ragnar displayed the dual nature of Viking leadership. He was a warrior who fought for personal glory, but also a leader who understood the importance of securing the future of his people. Ragnar's story shaped the Viking identity for centuries, serving as a touchstone for both the idealized image of the Viking warrior and the brutal reality of Viking life. His deeds, however exaggerated, were not just about personal triumph, but about the survival and resilience of the Viking people. The tales of Ragnar taught the Vikings what it meant to live honorably, to face death without fear, and to always fight for one's family and community. His legacy is evident in the cultural significance of Viking tallies, stories that valued bravery in battle, the protection of one's kin, and the pursuit of glory that would ensure one's place in history. Today, Ragnar Lothbrok is more than just a legendary figure. He is a cultural icon whose influence reaches beyond the Viking age. Modern depictions of Ragnar, particularly in literature and television, continue to shape how we view the Vikings. These portrayals, while often dramatized, echo the core themes of the sagas, themes of honor, strength, and the eternal struggle between life and death. Ragnar, though long gone, remains an enduring symbol of Viking identity, whose mythic qualities continued to captivate audiences worldwide. Ragnar Lothbrok's story is one of both triumph and tragedy, marked by his rise to fame and his eventual downfall. His ambition, his desire for glory, and his love for his people drove him to achieve great things, victories that earned him a place in history. But this same ambition also led to his eventual betrayal and death, showing that the price of glory in the Viking world was often high. Ragnar's life and death encapsulate the bittersweet realities of Viking existence, the constant tension between honor and sacrifice, between the quest for glory and the inevitable toll that comes with it. While Ragnar may have been driven by a desire to ensure his legacy, his personal sacrifices were steeped in the very struggles that defined the Viking age. His death in the snake pit, brutal and symbolic, served as a reminder that no warrior, no matter how great, could escape the unpredictability of fate. Ultimately, Ragnar's rise to fame came at the cost of his personal relationships. The constant battle for survival, and the emotional toll of living a life defined by violence and conquest. His death, while tragic, marked the beginning of an even greater saga, one of vengeance, glory, and the continuing cycle of Viking expansion that his sons would carry forward. Ragnar Lothbrok's legacy, shaped by both triumph and sacrifice, remains a powerful symbol of the Viking ethos: to fight for what is honorable, to never give up, and to face death with the strength of those who have lived a full, bold life. The Viking Age, spanning from the late 8th century to the early 11th century, is often characterized by violent raids and conquests, with the image of Viking warriors storming the shores of England, France, and Ireland firmly ingrained in popular culture. However, the Vikings were not merely raiders. They were also explorers and navigators of unparalleled skill, who carved out a complex legacy of discovery, trade, and settlement that extended far beyond the realms of battle. While the Vikings are often remembered for their destruction and looting, their true genius lay in their ability to adapt to new environments, expand their horizons, and create a lasting presence in foreign lands. Viking exploration was as much about survival and expansion as it was about conquest. As Scandinavian lands became increasingly overpopulated, the need for new resources and fertile lands became a driving force for the rather than simply taking to the seas for wealth or glory. The Vikings sought to build a presence in the world, establishing trade routes and settlements that spanned Europe, the Mediterranean, and even North America. Their journeys were a quest not just for treasure, but for sustenance and a way of life that would secure their futures for generations. The Vikings were not limited to the coasts of Europe and the known world of their time. They set sail into the unknown, driven by a natural curiosity about the world around them. While many cultures at the time were content to explore what was already known, the Vikings ventured far beyond their home shores, discovering new lands and expanding the boundaries of the known world. Their longships, engineered for both speed and flexibility, were the perfect tools for such exploration. With these ships, the Vikings could navigate not only open seas, but also shallow rivers, which allowed them to reach inland territories and establish fortified settlements in places that had never been accessed before. This spirit of exploration was fueled by the Vikings' innate desire to understand the world and to leave their mark on it. For them, the sea was both a source of danger and opportunity. The endless horizon represented the chance to push beyond the limits of known civilization and explore the uncharted waters that lay ahead. This sense of curiosity, combined with their technological innovation and the practical need for resources, turned the Vikings into more than just invaders. They were adventurers and pioneers, reshaping the world around them. Thus, Viking exploration was defined by a unique blend of necessity, curiosity, and innovation. The Vikings were driven by a desire not only to conquer but to understand the world they lived in. Their exploration was multidimensional, driven by the need for new resources and territories, but also fueled by an enduring belief in the importance of discovery, the idea that pushing beyond the known world could bring prosperity and security. The Vikings did not simply follow the established routes, but ventured boldly into new territories, charting courses that would become the lifeblood of trade and settlement for centuries to come. This section sets the stage for a broader understanding of Viking expansion, framing their exploration as a fundamental aspect of their culture and legacy. From sailing into uncharted waters to establishing settlements across Europe and into North America, Viking exploration was as much about building and settling as it was about raiding. The Vikings' longships were not merely vessels of war. They were marvels of shipbuilding that played a pivotal role in the Vikings' expansion and exploration across Europe and beyond. The longship's design was central to the Viking way of life, allowing them to carry out everything from raids to explorations into uncharted waters. The Vikings' mastery of shipbuilding enabled them to forge their way across the seas, creating a seafaring empire that stretched from the coastlines of Iceland to the Mediterranean. What made these ships so exceptional was their versatility and speed. The longships were designed with shallow drafts, meaning they could glide across both deep seas and shallow rivers. This allowed the Vikings to reach areas that were otherwise inaccessible to other civilizations, making them highly mobile both on the open ocean and inland waterways. The ability to navigate narrow rivers and shallow coastal areas gave the Vikings an advantage when raiding, as they could approach settlements unexpectedly. But it also enabled them to explore far beyond the coasts, into Europe's interior, and even as far as North America. The longship's design was highly innovative. The narrow, long, and sleek hull, allowed the ships to cut through the water with great speed, and their symmetrical shape meant they could reverse direction quickly, an invaluable characteristic for both raiding and exploration. They were light enough to be carried over land in some cases, facilitating inland travel and the ability to reach places that other boats could not. Built with a high stern and bow, they were often adorned with carved dragon heads that served as both a form of intimidation and a way to honor their gods, particularly the god of war, Odin. The longship wasn't just a tool for fighting. It was a lifeline for Viking communities. It facilitated the movement of goods, connected distant settlements, and enabled the Vikings to engage in trade across a vast network of regions. These ships weren't just used in battle. They were the very backbone of Viking expansion. Viking navigation was a delicate art that combined both practical tools and intuitive knowledge of the natural world. The Vikings did not have the sophisticated compasses and maps that later explorers would use. Instead, they relied on natural indicators and innovative tools to find their way across vast, often treacherous, stretches of sea. One of the most remarkable tools used by the Vikings was the sunstone, a special crystal, also known as Iceland spar, that helped them locate the position of the sun, even on cloudy days. The Vikings' ability to navigate on overcast days was critical for their long journeys, as the sun, even when obscured, would still cast a certain polarized light that the sunstone could reveal. This ability to find the sun through the clouds allowed the Vikings to remain on course, even when the skies were hidden, ensuring they could continue their voyages without being lost. In addition to the sunstone, the Vikings used the stars as their primary method of celestial navigation. The night sky was an essential tool for the Vikings, and they relied on certain constellations to help them steer their ships. The Polaris was particularly important because it provided a fixed point of reference in the sky. By navigating from one point to another based on the stars, the Vikings could chart a course that led them to distant lands. For example, when traveling westward toward Iceland or Greenland, the Vikings used the position of constellations like the Big Dipper to determine direction. Another key element in Viking navigation was the use of landmarks. Skilled navigators could identify landmarks in the distance, such as mountains, cliffs, or coastline features, to guide their journeys. These markers were especially crucial for coastal navigation, where familiar sites would guide them to safe harbors and new lands. The Vikings also understood the winds and currents. They learned to read the ocean's waves and winds, knowing when the weather would be in their favor and when they would need to wait for calmer conditions. This connection to nature was not only a practical skill, but also tied into their cultural practices, where they believed the forces of nature were controlled by their gods. Viking navigators were not merely skilled sailors. They were masters of the natural world. Their navigational expertise was not simply a technical skill. It was intertwined with their cultural identity and spiritual beliefs. For the Vikings, the sea was both a resource and a source of mystery, danger, and divine power. Navigating the vast stretches of water between known and unknown worlds required both practical knowledge and a deep-seated understanding of the forces that shaped their world. The Vikings' ability to survive at sea, in all manner of weather and water conditions, was due to the sophisticated training of their sailors. From a young age, Viking children were taught to understand the land and the sea. Navigators learned to identify winds, currents, and stars in ways that would be passed down through oral traditions. These skills were not written down in books, but rather taught in the form of stories and songs, passed from one generation to the next. The role of oral tradition in Viking society was crucial. Just as sagas and poems were preserved in oral form, the secrets of navigation were passed down by word of mouth. Young men and women would be taught the ways of the sea by their elders, how to read the signs of nature, how to understand the tides, and how to use their ships and tools to chart new routes. This transfer of knowledge was central to Viking society and to the continuation of their journeys across the seas. Viking exploration was not solely based on practicality and survival. It was also heavily influenced by Norse mythology, where the gods had a significant role in shaping how the Vikings viewed the sea and their voyage. The Vikings believed the oceans and the journey through them were controlled by powerful divine forces. The god Ngurd, the Norse god of the sea, wind, and wealth, was thought to oversee all maritime journeys. Vikings would often offer prayers and sacrifices to Ngurd before embarking on a long voyage, asking for safe passage and favorable winds. They believed that their success on the seas was not only due to their own skill, but to the favor of the gods. Odin, the All-Father, was another deity central to the Viking worldview. He was associated with wisdom, knowledge, and warfare. It was believed that Odin would watch over the warriors as they sailed toward new lands, guiding them toward their fate. In the Viking imagination, the sea was not just a physical barrier but also a spiritual one, a realm where gods, fate, and destiny played a direct role. The Vikings saw themselves as walking in the footsteps of the gods, undertaking voyages that had been blessed or condemned by the divine. As the Vikings voyaged toward new lands, they often looked to the heavens for guidance. The stars were seen as watchful eyes, the night sky a canvas of divine power. Each journey, whether to Iceland or North America, was part of a cosmic adventure where the mortal realm and the spiritual world intertwine. This belief added an extra layer of mysticism to the Vikings' exploration, transforming what might have been seen as simple navigation into something divinely ordained. Viking navigation and shipbuilding were central to their legacy of exploration. The longships and their ability to navigate difficult waters were not only technological marvels, but also symbols of the Vikings' mastery over the sea. Their knowledge of the natural world, from the sunstone to the stars, allowed them to push the boundaries of the known world, venturing into unknown territories with a combination of skill and divine favor. The Vikings were not just raiders, but explorers whose journeys across vast distances expanded the world in ways that still resonate today. Their exploration was guided not only by practical tools, but by a spiritual connection to the gods, making their voyages both a physical journey and a spiritual quest. Ragnar Lothbrok, one of the most iconic figures of the Viking Age, is often remembered for his raids and his warrior spirit. However, his legacy is more than just the brutality of the sword. It is also defined by his ambition to expand Viking influence beyond the coasts of Scandinavia. Ragnar was a visionary leader, and his ambition was not limited to raiding for treasure or glory alone. He sought to establish a dominant Viking presence in Europe, spreading Viking culture and influence through conquest and exploration. While Ragnar's legacy is largely defined by the Frankish raids, it is important to understand that these campaigns were also a strategic means of expanding Viking horizons. At a time when Viking lands were becoming increasingly overpopulated, the quest for new territories, resources, and opportunities for settlement became essential for Viking survival. Ragnar, like many other Viking leaders, recognized that the wealth of the Frankish kingdom, especially its fertile land and rich trade networks, was a valuable prize that could fuel the Viking ambitions for centuries to come. Ragnar's ambition extended beyond just territorial conquest. His expeditions were driven by a desire to discover new lands and expand the Viking influence into regions that had never been reached before. As the Viking Age unfolded, it became clear that Viking exploration would not just be limited to raids on the coasts of Europe, but would push into the heart of Western Europe, the Mediterranean, and even beyond the Atlantic. Among Ragnar's most famous exploits was his raid on Paris in 845 AD, an event that would come to define both his career and the Viking Age. Ragnar, with a fleet of approximately 120 ships and thousands of warriors, embarked on what would be one of the most daring raids in Viking history. His forces navigated the Seine River, bypassing the heavily fortified Frankish coast and striking deep into the heart of Carolingian France. The Siege of Paris is often remembered for its brutality and success, but it was also an important moment in Viking exploration. The Paris raid exemplified Viking military innovation, but it was also a strategic move to establish a Viking presence in Western Europe. While the Frankish Empire had long been a powerful presence, the Viking raids were meant not just to loot, but to create political leverage. In the aftermath of the raid, King Charles the Broad was forced to pay Ragnar a tribute, a clear indication of the shifting power dynamics between the Vikings and the Frankish kingdom. This raid, along with others conducted by Ragnar in the years preceding and following, can be seen as a precursor to the larger Viking expeditions that would follow in the centuries after. The Paris raid opened important doors for future Viking incursions into Europe, setting a precedent for further exploratory campaigns. It was not just about plunder. Ragnar and his warriors sought to expand Viking influence, securing new lands and routes for trade. Paris, once the center of power in the Frankish world, had now fallen to the Vikings, and it became symbolic of the far-reaching influence Ragnar had begun to exert across Europe. Ragnar, as a symbol of Viking exploration. Ragnar's story is deeply tied to the broader Viking spirit of exploration and adventure. While the Vikings are often depicted as ruthless raiders and conquerors, Ragnar's role in Viking history suggests a much deeper cultural and spiritual connection to exploration. Like many Viking leaders, Ragnar was driven not just by the promise of material wealth, but by the desire for new experiences. New lands, and the spiritual significance of venturing into the unknown. The Viking quest for new lands was not only motivated by necessity, the need for resources, land, and shelter, but also by curiosity. For the Vikings, the world beyond the seas was a place full of mystery and promise, a place where the unknown could be discovered, where wealth and honor could be earned, and where the gods themselves might show favor to those bold enough to set sail. Ragnar Lothbrok, as a leader, embraced these elements, seeing his raids and conquests as not just opportunities for wealth, but as the fulfillment of Viking ideals of exploration and growth. Ragnar's pursuit of new territories aligns with the Norse belief in fate and the role that exploration played in shaping their destiny. The Vikings saw themselves as warriors of destiny, whose journeys and quests were often divinely inspired by gods like Odin and Thor, whose presence loomed large in Viking imagination. For Ragnar, the world beyond Scandinavia was not just an opportunity for plunder, it was a spiritual journey, guided by a higher purpose, to prove his worth not just to his people, but to the gods themselves. Moreover, Ragnar's raids in France, England, and beyond were part of a larger Viking tradition of discovery. His naval expeditions were not merely military strikes, but also a part of a greater exploration movement, one that eventually led to the discovery of new lands like Iceland and Greenland. Ragnar's role in these early expeditions can be seen as a precursor to the more established voyages of the Viking explorers who would follow in his footsteps. Ragnar's story is not simply one of violence. It is also a tale of ambition and the pursuit of glory, not just in battle but in the unknown realms beyond. The desire to expand, to see and conquer new worlds was just as central to Ragnar's legacy as his military prowess. His voyages were an embodiment of the Viking thirst for discovery, a drive that extended beyond the limits of familiar shores and into the realms of spirituality and exploration. Ragnar's exploration as a legacy of Viking innovation. Ragnar's impact on Viking exploration cannot be understood simply through his military campaign. It must also be considered in the context of the innovative spirit that drove him and other Viking leaders to embark on long and dangerous voyages. The Vikings were not merely focused on conquest. They sought to build, expand, and learn about the world around them. Ragnar, through his raids and explorations, served as a catalyst for future generations of Viking sailors, traders, and explorers who would follow in his wake. Ragnar's legacy is one of both military conquest and discovery. His actions, while setting the stage for many of the great Viking raids to come, were also part of a larger movement that transformed the Vikings from mere raiders into the explorers and settlers of new worlds. Ragnar's name became synonymous with a culture defined not only by battle, but by the drive to explore, to learn, and to expand Viking horizons across both the known and unknown worlds. By venturing deep into Frankish lands, Ragnar opened doors for future Viking trade, exploration, and settlement. His spirit of adventure, resilience, and curiosity became hallmarks of the Viking identity, which would live on through the achievements of his sons and other Viking leaders. Ragnar thus serves as both a symbol and a catalyst for the great Viking expansion, inspiring generations to come. Ragnar Lothbrok, through his leadership, raids, and spirit of exploration, represents the very essence of the Viking Age, a time when discovery was as vital as conquest, and the sea was both a pathway to wealth and a realm full of mystery. Ragnar's story, filled with both daring conquests and visionary exploration, reflects a deeper drive within the Vikings to not only dominate, but also to expand, explore, and understand the world. His legacy as an explorer and conqueror continues to influence how we view the Viking Age today, as an era defined not just by violence, but by the daring spirit of discovery and the unquenchable thirst for adventure. Leif Erikson, son of the famed Eric the Red, is widely recognized as one of the most significant explorers of the Viking Age. While Christopher Columbus is often credited with discovering the Americas, Leif's voyages to the North American continent predate Columbus by nearly 500 years, making him the first known European to set foot on North American soil. His journey to what the Vikings called Vinland, Newfoundland, marks one of the greatest achievements in Viking exploration. Leif's journey to Vinland began around 1008, when he sailed from Greenland, following the navigational skills passed down through Viking traditions. According to the sagas, Leif was initially tasked with heading to Norway, where he would seek the favor of King Olaf Tryggvason, the King of Norway, and convert the Vikings to Christianity. However, during his voyage, Leif and his crew encountered a mysterious land to the west, one that had been hinted at in earlier Viking oral stories, but had never been fully explored. The journey to Vinland was not a single voyage, but part of a larger Viking drive to expand their horizons and explore the uncharted regions of the North Atlantic. The exact route is still debated, but it is believed that Leif and his crew sailed from Greenland, navigated through the cold waters of the North Atlantic, and reached the coast of North America by the shores of modern-day Newfoundland in Canada. This remarkable journey added to the Viking legacy of maritime exploration and marked the Viking expansion far beyond Europe. Leif's discovery of Vinland was a monumental moment in Viking history. Not only did it mark the Vikings' first known presence in the Americas, but it also represented the culmination of the Viking spirit of adventure and discovery. Leif's ability to navigate across such vast, unexplored waters using the stars, the sunstones, and traditional navigation techniques showcases the Viking mastery of sea exploration. But his discovery was not just about reaching new lands. It was about expanding the known world and pushing the boundaries of what was possible. The accounts of Leif Erikson's voyages to Vinland are preserved in the Vinland sagas, which are among the most famous literary works from the Viking Age. The sagas were written down centuries after the events they describe, but they preserve the legends, values, and history of the Vikings, providing an invaluable glimpse into Viking exploration and culture. Two main sagas, the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red, offer accounts of Leif's journey. While the sagas are known for their poetic embellishments, they offer vital details about Leif's voyages and his discovery of Vinland. According to the sagas, Leif and his crew first landed in a land they named Vinland due to its abundance of grapevines, a product of the warm climate they encountered. The sagas describe the landscape of Vinland as lush, fertile, and abundant with resources, offering an ideal place for settlement. Leif's crew spent the winter in Vinland, enduring the hardships of the unknown land. The sagas recount the encounters with the indigenous peoples of the region, whom the Vikings referred to as the Vikings' initial contact with the indigenous peoples was peaceful, but tensions eventually arose, leading to conflicts. This episode in the sagas reflects the Vikings' ability to engage with other cultures, but also the challenges they faced in settling new territories. The Vinland sagas provide vivid sensory descriptions of the land. They speak of lush forests, fertile soil, and bountiful wildlife, painting a picture of a land full of potential. Yet, the harsh realities of settling a new land also come through in the sagas. The long winters, the constant struggle for survival, and the tensions between the settlers and the indigenous peoples. These challenges reflect the broader Viking experience of survival, exploration, and adaptation. While the historical accuracy of some details in the sagas is debated, they are invaluable in preserving the memory of Leif's discovery of Vinland and the significance of this achievement for the Viking. The sagas not only commemorate Leif's journey, but also embody the mythic nature of Viking exploration. The blending of fact and legend helped to transform the discovery of North America into a mythical event, one that would inspire generations of Vikings to continue their journey of discovery. Leif Erikson's voyage to Vinland had profound implications for both Viking exploration and the Viking worldview. The discovery of North America expanded the Viking concept of the world beyond the familiar coasts of Europe and the North Atlantic. Leif's voyages to Vinland proved that there were new lands to the west, offering an entire continent full of potential. This discovery significantly altered how Vikings saw the world and reinforced their inherent curiosity and drive for exploration. For the Vikings, Leif's journey was a symbolic expansion of their influence. They saw themselves as warriors of destiny, constantly striving to push the boundaries of the known world and secure their place in it. The discovery of Vinland was not just an isolated incident but part of a broader pattern of Viking expansion. From Greenland to Iceland, and from the coasts of Ireland and Britain to the shores of the Mediterranean, Viking exploration was driven by the need for new resources, land and opportunities for trade. Leif's discovery of the New World was just one part of a larger Viking push to explore and settle new territories. Leif's voyages also shaped the Viking perception of success and achievement. To discover new lands meant that a Viking leader's influence extended beyond the borders of their known world. It meant immortality, not just through tales of battle but through the creation of settlements in new lands. For Leif, his journey to Vinland represented both a personal triumph and a symbol of Viking dominance. His name would be immortalized in the sagas as the man who first reached North America, leaving a legacy that continues to echo through history. Moreover, Leif's discovery of Vinland also shifted the Viking perception of boundaries and geography. What once seemed like endless, hostile ocean was now a sea that connected the Vikings to new frontiers. Leif's journey demonstrated the expansive nature of the Viking world, showing that there were no limits to where they could go. It expanded their understanding of the world, not just as a series of small, isolated lands, but as a complex, interconnected network of possibilities for settlement, trade, and exploration. Leif Erikson's voyages to Vinland represent one of the most significant milestones in the history of Viking exploration. His discovery of North America was not just a physical journey across the sea, it was a spiritual and cultural expansion of Viking horizons. Leif's voyages opened up new lands, opportunities, and challenges for the Vikings, reinforcing their spirit of exploration, adventure, and conquest. While Leif may not have been the first to discover new lands, his voyages were groundbreaking in their scope and significance. His legacy is not just defined by the lands he discovered, but by the idea of what was possible. His voyages proved that there were new worlds to be conquered, and that the Vikings had the will, courage, and skill to push beyond the boundaries of the known world. Through the sagas, Leif's journey continues to inspire us today. The Vinland sagas serve as a reminder of the Viking legacy, a legacy of exploration, discovery, and the unyielding spirit to venture into the unknown. Leif Erikson's journey is not just a chapter in Viking history, it is a symbol of the spirit of human curiosity, and the drive to expand the world, a drive that continues to inspire explorers even today. While the Vikings are most often associated with their raids on the coasts of Britain, France, and Ireland, their influence stretched far beyond the familiar northern territories. One of the most striking aspects of Viking expansion was their reach into the Mediterranean, a region that, by the Viking Age, was dominated by established empires such as the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Caliphate. The Vikings' seafaring technology, particularly their remarkable longships, was key to their success in venturing into these distant waters, far from their Scandinavian homelands. Viking ships, designed for both open seas and shallow river navigation, allowed them to travel swiftly along the coasts of Iberia, the North African coast, and into the Mediterranean Sea. In these regions, the Vikings engaged in both raids and trade, seeking wealth, resources, and new markets. The Iberian Peninsula in particular was an important target for Viking raids, with Al-Andalus and the Christian kingdoms of northern Spain suffering from Viking invasions. The Vikings were drawn to the riches of the Iberian coast, fertile land, precious metals, and vibrant trade hubs. The North African coast was another vital area of Viking expansion. Though not as heavily raided as Iberia, the region provided opportunities for trade and piracy, especially through interactions with the Islamic world. The Vikings established connections with merchants and traders, allowing them to participate in a growing Mediterranean trading network. Their involvement in these trade routes linked them to distant parts of the world, from the Middle East to Europe. One of the most fascinating aspects of Viking expansion into the Mediterranean was the establishment of the Varangian Guard. This elite unit of Viking mercenaries served the Byzantine Empire, providing an outlet for Viking warriors seeking fortune and status. The Varangian Guard was founded in the 10th century, when Viking leaders, such as Rurik and his descendants, formed political and military ties with the Byzantine emperors. By the time of the Byzantine Emperor Basil II, the Varangians had become an indispensable part of the Byzantine military. The Guard was made up primarily of Scandinavians, with Vikings from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden serving as elite soldiers. The Varangians were renowned for their loyalty, bravery, and fearlessness in battle, which earned them the favor of the Byzantine Empire. For the Vikings, joining the Varangian Guard represented an opportunity for prestige, wealth, and political connections in the Byzantine Empire, which was one of the most powerful states of the time. The Guard's role as elite soldiers and personal bodyguards to the emperor gave them access to the riches of Constantinople, a thriving hub of culture, art, and trade. For the Byzantine Empire, the Varangians provided valuable fighting skills, adding an extra layer of military strength to their already formidable forces. The Varangian Guard also served as a bridge between the Vikings and the Byzantine Empire. Through their presence in the Byzantine court, the Vikings were introduced to new technologies, diplomatic strategies, and cultural practices that influenced Viking society. The interactions between the two cultures created a lasting bond, allowing for further trade, cultural exchange, and exploration in the Mediterranean world. Viking exploration was not solely about raiding or military expansion. It was also about establishing trade routes that connected the East and West. The Vikings' ability to navigate both the North Sea and Mediterranean allowed them to become key players in international trade networks, particularly those linked to the Silk Road. While the Silk Road is most famously associated with Chinese and Central Asian merchants, the Vikings' role in this vast network was significant. Through their settlements along the Volga River in Russia and their connections with the Byzantine Empire and the Vikings gained access to luxury goods such as silks, spices, precious metals, and exotic animals. The Kievan Rus, a powerful Viking kingdom in Eastern Europe, became a critical hub for trade between the Byzantine Empire and the regions of the steppes in Central Asia. The Vikings used their longships to travel down the Volga River, allowing them to transport goods to the heart of Asia and bring Eastern treasures back to Scandinavia. Through these trade routes, the Vikings were introduced to not only luxurious goods, but also to new ideas, technologies, and cultural practices that would influence Viking society. For example, Islamic traders from the Middle East introduced the Vikings to advanced mathematical techniques and architectural styles, while the Byzantines offered artistic and political knowledge. In addition to trade, the Vikings established important trading posts across Europe and into the Mediterranean. Their most well-known trading post was in the city of Stockholm, which acted as a central trading hub between Scandinavia, the Byzantine Empire, and the Islamic world. These trade networks helped integrate Viking society into a global economy that spanned across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, further solidifying their presence as skilled traders, explorers, and cultural intermediaries. One of the most enduring aspects of Viking expansion was the cultural exchange that took place between the Vikings and the societies they interacted with, particularly the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic. These interactions were not just about warfare and trade. They were also about sharing knowledge, art, and ideas, which would leave a lasting impact on Viking culture. Through their interactions with the Byzantines, the Vikings gained access to Greek fire, a powerful weapon used in naval warfare, as well as advanced engineering techniques and military tactics. This exchange of knowledge helped the Vikings to continue refining their shipbuilding skills and military strategies, making them even more formidable in their future raids. The Vikings' contacts with the Islamic world were similarly influential. In particular, the Vikings traded with the Abbasid Caliph, which controlled large parts of the Middle East. These exchanges included the acquisition of luxury goods, spices, and artistic influences, but they also involved the transfer of scientific and mathematical knowledge. The Vikings, who valued both practical skills and warfare, incorporated elements of Islamic astronomy and navigation into their own practices, which in turn influenced their exploration and ability to travel vast distances. Additionally, through their mercenary work in the Varangian Guard, the Vikings were exposed to Byzantine art, literature, and religious practices. The Byzantine Empire's rich Christian heritage had a profound impact on Viking society, which eventually led to the conversion of many Viking leaders and communities to Christianity. This religious and cultural exchange, though sometimes fraught with tension, helped shape the Vikings' interactions with other European cultures in the centuries that followed. The Vikings were not just raiders, they were also traders, mercenaries, and cultural emissaries who played a central role in shaping the economic and cultural landscape of Europe, Asia, and the Mediterranean. Their ability to connect distant cultures, from the Byzantine Empire to the Islamic Caliph, helped expand their influence across vast territories. Through the Varangian Guard, Viking trade routes, and cultural exchanges, the Vikings became an integral part of the broader world, bridging East and West and contributing to the global flow of goods, knowledge, and ideas. This cultural exchange, whether through the goods they traded or the ideas they encountered, deeply impacted Viking society, leaving a lasting legacy that transcended mere conquest. The Vikings' expansion into the Mediterranean and beyond highlights their ability not only to raid and conquer, but to adapt and integrate into the broader world, influencing both their own culture and the cultures they encountered. The Viking Age was a time of immense discovery and expansion, and the voyages of the Vikings had a profound and lasting impact on European exploration and the world at large. While the Vikings are most famous for their raids and military conquests, their exploration of new lands helped lay the foundation for the great age of European navigation that followed in the centuries after their expeditions. Viking explorers like Leif Erikson, who set sail to Vinland around the year 1008, were some of the first Europeans to reach the New World, an accomplishment that predates Christopher Columbus by almost 5 centuries. This discovery of North America not only expanded the Vikings' geographical knowledge, but it also influenced later navigators and explorers, like Columbus, who would go on to chart courses that forever changed the course of history. Viking exploration was significant because it proved that European navigators could travel great distances across the Atlantic Ocean. Designed for both open ocean and shallow river navigation, were technological marvels that made such voyages possible. This advancement in shipbuilding technology was later adopted by European explorers, who were inspired by the Viking examples of navigating vast, unknown territories. In the centuries that followed the Viking Age, explorers like John Cabot and Christopher Columbus built upon the knowledge that Vikings had accumulated about the North Atlantic and the New World. Columbus' journey, while famously credited with discovering America, was in part made possible because of earlier Viking exploration. The Viking knowledge of Atlantic navigation laid the groundwork for future explorers to understand that it was possible to sail across the ocean and to new, faraway lands. In many ways, the Vikings were the precursors to modern European exploration, providing the knowledge, the technology, and the spirit of adventure that would drive later generations to continue exploring and mapping the globe. Enduring fascination with Viking exploration. Despite the passage of over 1,000 years, the Viking Age continues to capture the imaginations of modern scholars, historians, and adventurers alike. Viking exploration represents a period of bold risk-taking, where seafaring warriors ventured into the unknown, discovering new lands, interacting with foreign cultures, and building a legacy that has left an indelible mark on history. Modern-day scholars and historians continue to study Viking exploration, because it represents a pivotal moment in human history. The Vikings were not just raiders and warriors, they were pioneers, venturing far beyond their homelands into regions where no European had ever set foot before. Their ability to cross the North Atlantic, settle in Iceland and Greenland, and even make contact with the shores of North America is seen as a monumental achievement in terms of human adaptation and navigation. For adventure seekers, the Viking Age embodies the spirit of discovery, the curiosity and daring that lead explorers to chart unknown territories. Driven by a desire to expand their horizons and push the limits of human knowledge, today's explorers, whether they are pilots or even space travelers, draw inspiration from the courage and resourcefulness of Viking navigators. The idea that one can travel into uncharted waters, face the unknown, and emerge victorious continues to resonate deeply with modern adventurers. Moreover, the sense of adventure and discovery that characterized Viking exploration has become part of the modern cultural landscape. The very concept of exploration, whether through the seas or space, still carries the same mysticism and thrill that Viking voyagers must have felt as they set out on their journeys into the unknown. Viking exploration in popular culture. The fascination with Viking exploration is not confined to academic circles. The mythologization of the Vikings and their adventures has been an integral part of modern popular culture, particularly in television, books, and films. Viking exploration has been presented not only as a series of historical events, but as a living, breathing saga that continues to captivate audiences today. The television series Vikings, for instance, provides a dramatic portrayal of Viking exploration, blending historical fact with legend to create an exciting narrative about Viking raids, explorations, and settlements. While the show takes liberties with historical events, it brings attention to the broader Viking spirit of discovery, showing characters like Ragnar Lothbrok pushing boundaries, whether through military conquests or exploration of distant lands. Through such media, the exploration of new lands, like the discovery of Vinland, is brought to life in a way that resonates with modern audiences, reinforcing the sense of adventure and the human drive to expand. Books, too, have kept Viking exploration alive. The Vinland sagas, written centuries ago, were some of the first records of Viking exploration. These texts have influenced many modern novels and historical fiction works that delve into Viking exploration. Authors like Viggo Mortensen in his role as Eric the Red in films, or historical novelists like Mika Walteri in his book The Wanderer, have continued the tradition of mythologizing Viking exploration, presenting their voyages as heroic and filled with mystical undertones. Moreover, Viking exploration has found its way into the world of video games. where players take on the roles of Viking explorers embarking on journeys to distant lands. Games like Assassin's Creed Valhalla and the Banner Saga offer players a chance to live out the Viking experience, from raids and conquests to sailing the seas and exploring the vast world beyond. These representations in popular culture serve as a reminder that the spirit of Viking exploration is still alive in the modern world, inviting new generations to learn about and engage with the Viking legacy. In these modern renditions of Viking exploration, the message remains clear. The Vikings were not only fierce warriors, but adventurers and explorers whose journeys shaped the future of navigation, trade, and culture. By mythologizing their voyages, popular culture keeps the spirit of Viking exploration alive, inspiring new generations to reach for the unknown, much as the Vikings did centuries ago. Conclusion: Viking exploration was a defining characteristic of the Viking Age, leaving a profound and lasting legacy. Their voyages across the seas not only influenced later European exploration but also shaped our modern understanding of adventure, discovery, and human achievement. Today, their legacy continues to inspire and captivate, whether through scholarly exploration, popular media, or the ongoing fascination with their daring exploits. From the discovery of Vinland to their reach into the Mediterranean, the Vikings were pioneers, laying the groundwork for future exploration and leaving an indelible mark on the world. Through the continued study of their travels and the portrayal of their voyages in popular culture, we are reminded that the spirit of Viking exploration is one of enduring fascination, representing the timeless quest to discover and expand the boundaries of the known world. Viking exploration was much more than a series of raids and conquests. It was a defining characteristic of the Viking Age, representing the relentless spirit of discovery that pushed the boundaries of the known world. From the legendary voyages of Ragnar Lothbrok to the daring expeditions of Leif Erikson, the Vikings saw themselves not just as warriors, but as pioneers, continually searching for new lands, resources, and opportunities. They ventured far beyond their Scandinavian homeland, from the coasts of Iceland and Greenland to the shores of North America, driven by the desire to expand their influence and secure a future for their people. While their history is often painted with the bloodshed of battle, the Vikings were also driven by a deep sense of curiosity and adventurous spirit. They were constantly on the move, seeking new territories to settle, new peoples to trade with, and new lands to explore. Their longships were not only tools of warfare, but vessels of discovery, enabling them to cross the seas with unmatched precision. Viking sailors were among the first to navigate the vast expanses of the North Atlantic, proving that discovery was just as integral to their identity as raid and conquest. The Vikings were not satisfied with simply existing within the boundaries of their homeland. They sought to expand their world, pushing out into the unknown with both boldness and skill. Whether it was the exploratory voyage to Vinland by Leif Erikson or the raids on the Frankish kingdom by Ragnar Lothbrok, the Vikings paved the way for a new understanding of what was possible. They connected Europe with the far-reaching shores of Iceland, North America, and even parts of the Mediterranean, all while maintaining their unique cultural identity. Ragnar Lothbrok, often remembered as the archetype of the Viking warrior, was more than just a conqueror. His life laid the groundwork for the expansion of Viking culture, not just through military action, but through the very spirit of exploration. Ragnar's raids, though violent and aggressive, were also a part of a greater Viking tradition that involved establishing influence, finding new trade routes, and expanding into unknown territory. His ambitions were not just about plunder. They were about securing a future for the Viking. By gaining access to new lands and resources, Ragnar's leadership exemplified the Viking balance between conflict and discovery, with his actions often serving as a precursor to the more peaceful explorations that would follow. Though Ragnar's story is often overshadowed by his violent campaigns, it is through his journeys that Viking exploration truly flourished. His legacy is not just one of conquests, but also of laying the pathway for the Vikings' reach across Europe and beyond, where they could engage in trade, settle new territories, and continue their legacy of discovery. Ragnar was part of a larger cycle, one that seamlessly blended warfare with exploration, where each conquest or raid ultimately expanded the horizons of Viking civilization. The story of Ragnar Lothbrok, both as myth and history, continues to inspire us to seek the unknown, to push beyond our limits, and to boldly venture into new frontiers, much as the Vikings did centuries ago. In their fearless exploration of new lands, the Vikings proved that discovery and expansion were as integral to their identity as conquest and battle. Ragnar's life reminds us that even in the face of danger and uncertainty, there is a spirit of adventure that drives humanity forward. The Vikings, with their curiosity, their ships, and their ambitions, opened the world to new possibilities, much like how modern explorers, scientists, and adventurers continue to push the boundaries of knowledge and reach into the unknown. Just as Ragnar Lothbrok sailed into the distant horizons with his warriors, leaving behind a legacy of exploration and unwavering ambition, we, too, are called to seek out the unexplored territories in our own lives, whether physical, intellectual, or spiritual. The Vikings' story, led by figures like Ragnar, reminds us that the quest for knowledge, for discovery, and for growth is endless. Their voyages serve as a reminder that sometimes the greatest adventures lie beyond the edge of the map, waiting to be explored. The Viking Age was not simply a time of raids and plunder, but a time of bold discovery, where the spirit of exploration guided them to new frontiers. A legacy that continues to inspire generations to venture into new realms, to boldly chart unknown territories, and to reach for the stars. Viking society was a dynamic and hierarchical structure that was deeply influenced by both warfare and agriculture, with a clear division between the elite, freemen, and thralls. Understanding the social framework of Viking communities is crucial to appreciating how Viking leadership influenced their military, cultural, and political legacy. At the top of this structure were the chieftains and kings, the elite class whose power was not simply handed down but earned through merit, strength, and charisma. These leaders, while often defined by their martial prowess, were also responsible for shaping the broader political, spiritual, and economic landscape of Viking society. The Viking social hierarchy was a reflection of the culture's reliance on both strength and cohesion. At the top were the elite, the kings, chieftains, and nobles who led their people in both battle and settlement. Beneath them were the freemen, who were independent landowners or skilled craftsmen. These freemen were responsible for much of the Viking economy, engaging in farming, trade, and craftsmanship. Finally, at the bottom of the social structure were the thralls, slaves who performed the labor that sustained Viking society, but had no personal freedom or rights. The chieftains and kings held the greatest influence in Viking communities. These leaders were responsible for governing their territories, maintaining order, and directing military campaigns. The power of Viking rulers was not solely derived from their birthright, but from their ability to lead in battle, secure resources, and command the loyalty of their followers. Leadership was earned through demonstrated ability in warfare, strategic alliances, and the ability to provide for the people. The role of power and leadership in Viking society. Power and leadership were intricately tied to the capacity to lead people through both times of peace and war. The Viking ideal of leadership was based on merit, and kings and chieftains were expected to demonstrate their strength, wisdom, and ability to protect and expand their people's interests. Power was not inherited in a strict dynastic sense, as was the case in many other societies. Instead, a man became a leader based on his accomplishments and personal strength. A Viking leader's power was often tied to his ability to control resources, his prowess in battle, and the loyalty he commanded from his warriors. Leaders who earned respect through victories and successful raids would accumulate wealth, land, and followers. This loyalty was often forged in battle, where warriors swore fealty to their chieftain in exchange for protection and spoils of war. Viking kings could unite scattered tribes and villages, expanding their territory through conquest or diplomacy. Their leadership was essential for the survival of the community, as they were expected to provide protection from rivals, organize raids, and ensure access to resources. However, this power was not absolute. Viking kings had to maintain the consent of their warriors, was the ultimate check on the king's authority. This collective decision-making was an essential element of Viking governance, where leaders were held accountable by their people. The Viking elite served not only as military leaders, but also as spiritual and cultural guides for their people. While the warrior culture of the Vikings is widely known, the elite also played a key role in preserving and passing on the cultural traditions of their people, including their religious beliefs, laws, and social norms. Viking kings and chieftains were considered guardians of tradition. Their role extended beyond the battlefield to include the oversight of religious rituals and the preservation of pagan customs, as well as the promotion of Viking values like honor, bravery, and community solidarity. As the spiritual leaders of their people, kings were expected to participate in ceremonies dedicated to the gods, such as sacrifices to Odin, Thor, and other deities. They played a direct role in maintaining the Viking worldview, where the sea, the land, and the forces of nature were governed by divine powers. In addition to their spiritual duties, the Viking elite were also cultural icons. They were responsible for preserving Viking history, which was primarily transmitted orally through sagas, poetry, and storytelling. Kings and chieftains were often celebrated as the heroes of these stories, immortalized as both leaders and warriors who fought to expand Viking territories and protect their people. The elite was central to the social fabric of Viking society, representing the idealized Viking warrior who embodied both physical strength and intellectual leadership. By serving as both military leaders and cultural icons, Viking elites were crucial in maintaining the unity and strength of Viking society. Their leadership was a cornerstone of the Viking Age, driving expansion, preserving cultural values, and ensuring that Viking society could continue to thrive across the varied and often hostile landscapes they inhabited. The Viking social structure was built on the idea that leadership must be earned and maintained through strength, wisdom, and the elite, including kings and chieftains, played a crucial role in shaping Viking society, both through military might and by preserving and promoting the culture that defined the Vikings. These leaders were essential in not only expanding Viking influence through conquest, but also in ensuring that Viking traditions and values endured. By placing great emphasis on the ability of leaders to earn power rather than simply inherit it, Viking society ensured that only the strongest and most capable individuals could rise to the top. As a result, Viking kings and chieftains were not merely figures of authority but were central to the survival and growth of Viking civilization, inspiring loyalty and respect among their followers, while playing a key role in expanding the Viking legacy across Europe and beyond. Viking kings and chieftains were not merely figures of authority, they were warriors first and foremost. The Viking concept of leadership was deeply rooted in military prowess, where a leader's strength in battle and strategic acumen played a crucial role in their rise to power. The Vikings were a warrior society, and kings were expected to lead by example, both on the battlefield and in times of peace. This dual role, as both a military leader and a governor of people, defined the kingship and chieftaincy in Viking culture. Take the example of Ragnar Lothbrok, the legendary Viking king whose name has been immortalized in sagas. Ragnar's rise to power was not simply a matter of inheritance. He earned his reputation as a warrior king by leading successful raids and conquering lands. His story, while blending myth and history, reveals the Viking ideal of leadership. That kings were meant to be brave, honorable, and capable of securing wealth and territory through both conquest and leadership. Kings like Ragnar often built their power base through raids that enriched their people and allowed them to expand their rule. Similarly, Harald Fairhair, who became the first king of a unified Norway, was a king shaped by his ability to conquer and expand territory. His rise was marked by his victory in numerous battles, eventually bringing smaller Viking tribes and regions under his rule. His success, as with other Viking kings, was a result of his skill as a warrior and his ability to forge alliances with neighboring leaders. Ivar the Bonus, another key figure in Viking leadership, exemplified the same martial prowess. Though he suffered from a physical ailment, his reputation as a fierce and cunning warrior, capable of leading raids into England, helped him solidify his status as a powerful Viking leader. The martial achievements of figures like Ivar were often viewed as a key to their legitimacy and authority. How kings were chosen. The Viking process of choosing kings was far from the hereditary monarchy systems of many European societies. While some kings passed down their titles to their sons, leadership was not automatically inherited in the way we understand in modern times. Instead, Viking kings were often chosen based on personal strength, courage, and the ability to win respect from their warriors and followers. Meritocracy played a crucial role in Viking leadership, where warriors pledged allegiance to their chieftains because of respect for their skills in battle, rather than birthright alone. This practice made Viking kingship quite different from other European monarchies. A king had to prove himself in battle and demonstrate leadership before his rule was solidified. The Thing, a Viking assembly where the freemen and warriors would gather to settle disputes and make decisions, was central to this. If a king failed to meet expectations or was seen as weak, his followers could easily challenge him, potentially deposing him in favor of a more capable leader. This was most evident in the case of Ragnar Lothbrok, whose kingship was not simply handed down to him by inheritance, but earned through his accomplishments in battle and raids. Similarly, Harold Fairhair's rise to power was marked by his victories and his ability to unite disparate clans through force and diplomacy. Even after becoming king, his authority was continually tested by his ability to succeed in raids and expand his kingdom. This understanding of kingship demonstrates the Viking belief that leadership was a dynamic process, one that required a king to prove his worth continuously. The power of Viking kings was not static, but was instead rooted in their capacity to lead and their ability to navigate the complexities of warfare and diplomacy. Warrior kings. Viking kings as leaders in battle in Viking society. Kings were considered warriors first. A king who could not lead his people in battle or secure victories was not a king for long. Viking kings had to be warriors, capable of leading their armies in raids and defending their kingdoms. Unlike other monarchs, who often took a more passive role in warfare, Viking kings were expected to be at the forefront of battle, spearheading military campaigns and raids. The role of the warrior king was crucial in maintaining the Viking way of life. The Viking economy, much of which was based on raiding and pillaging, required kings who could expand their territory, gather spoils, and increase wealth. Without the warrior kings to lead them, Viking society would not have been able to sustain its expansion and prosperity. These kings had to demonstrate bravery, leadership, and strategic thinking in battle to prove their worth to their warriors. For instance, Ivar the Boneless, known for his strategic brilliance, exemplified this warrior king archetype. Despite his physical limitations, Ivar, intelligence, and ability to lead. His warriors in successful campaigns solidified his status as one of the most feared Viking leaders. He helped lead the great heathen army into England, avenging his father's death and asserting Viking dominance in the region. Viking political system and governance. Viking society was characterized by a combination of decentralization and pragmatic governance, which included a variety of systems for ensuring that leaders could keep their power. One of the key institutions in Viking governance was the Thing, or assembly. This was where chieftains, kings, and the freemen of Viking communities would gather to make decisions on matters of law, disputes, and community affairs. The Thing was central to the functioning of Viking society. It allowed for the participation of the people in decision-making, but it also acted as a check on the power of kings and chiefs. Although kings held significant power, they could not simply impose decisions unilaterally. They had to consult with the Thing and gain the support of their warriors and freemen. This ensured that leadership was accountable to the people, and it gave the warriors and landowners a voice in decisions that directly affected their lives. Laws and customs were also debated and enforced at the Thing. Disputes between clans or between individuals were settled here. The laws governing everything from inheritance to trade were created and enforced. This system ensured a degree of order within Viking society, even amid the violent and tumultuous nature of their raids and military conquests. Viking kings also used diplomacy and marriage alliances as important tools for consolidating power and expanding their influence. Marrying into other royal families was a common tactic used by kings like Harold Fairhair to strengthen his position and gain support from other Viking clans. These alliances helped kings maintain their territorial gains and foster unity within the Viking world. The role of Viking kings and chiefs was pivotal not only in their military conquests, but in shaping the very structure and values of Viking society. The dual role of warrior kings leading both their armies and their people made them central figures in the Viking world. Their rise to power, shaped by strength and merit, was an essential part of what made Viking society so formidable and expansive. With their influence over military campaigns, trade routes, and governance, Viking kings and chieftains were not only the conquerors of new lands, but also the architects of Viking society. Their ability to navigate the complex balance of leadership, warfare, and political alliances allowed Viking culture to thrive and expand, leaving a lasting legacy that continues to inspire awe and curiosity to this day. The Vikings are often remembered for their fearsome raids and warrior culture, but their legacy extends far beyond just their military might. One of the most critical aspects of Viking society was their economic power, derived not only from raiding, but also from a sophisticated system of trade. Viking elites accumulated wealth by establishing extensive trade networks that connected Scandinavia to the farthest reaches of Europe, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and even Asia. This network allowed the Vikings to trade a variety of goods, from furs and timber to silver, precious metals, and slaves. contributing to their ability to maintain power and influence over vast territories. The Vikings' trade routes spanned a vast geography, linking the Baltic Sea in Scandinavia to the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Caliphates in the south, and extending as far east as the Volga River in the heart of Asia. Their seafaring ships, capable of navigating both open seas and inland rivers, were integral in establishing and maintaining these routes. Long ships allowed Viking traders to move swiftly between coastal ports and inland cities, facilitating the exchange of goods across disparate cultures and regions. Viking merchants were involved in the long-distance trade of luxury goods such as silks, spices, wine, and textiles, which they brought from the east. In return, they traded items such as slaves, furs, and amber from the Nordic lands, goods that were highly valued in southern markets. This exchange helped Viking elites to accumulate substantial wealth, which they could use to fund military expeditions, expand their territory, and secure their power within the Viking world. Some of the most important trade centers in the Viking world were cities that acted as vital hubs for the Vikings' extensive trade routes. One of the most significant of these was Staraya Ladoga, located at the head of the Volga River in modern-day Russia. Staraya Ladoga, often considered the gateway to the east, was a major settlement and trading post for the It was here that Viking merchants and traders would converge to exchange goods with Byzantine and Khazar traders, linking the Vikings with the wealth of the Byzantine Empire, Islamic territories, and the Silk Road. The importance of Staraya Ladoga cannot be overstated, as it served as a critical connector between the Viking world and the Far Eastern trade routes, giving the Vikings access to both Eastern Europe and Central Asia. As Viking power grew, Staraya Ladoga also became an important center for the Kievan Rus, where Viking elites, like the Varangians, played a crucial role in the formation of the early Russian state. In the Mediterranean, Viking elites had established connections with the Byzantine Empire, where cities like Constantinople served as key hubs for Viking trade and political influence. The Varangian Guard, a group of Viking mercenaries, who served as elite bodyguards for the Byzantine Emperor, not only offered military protection but also facilitated trade between the Vikings and the Byzantines. These trade relationships helped the Vikings gain access to valuable goods such as Byzantine silk, jewels, and other luxury items, which contributed to the wealth and status of the Viking elite. The wealth generated by trade and raiding helped maintain the military power and political influence of Viking kings and elites. Viking elites used their accumulated wealth not just to fund military expeditions, but also to establish and maintain settlements and trade routes. This wealth gave Viking rulers the ability to expand their territories and strengthen their kingdoms, allowing them to grow beyond the confines of Scandinavia. For example, the wealth gained from raids in England and the Byzantine Empire was used by Viking kings like Ragnar, Lothbrok and Ivar the Bonus to secure political power through land and military alliances. Their riches enabled the construction of fortresses and the fortification of key strategic points in Viking-held territories. In places like York, in modern-day England, Viking elites established strongholds that served both as centers of political control and as hubs of commerce. Similarly, the Dunallau or region in England ruled by Viking kings, after their raids in the 9th century, was not only a military stronghold but also a vibrant economic region. The wealth of Viking settlers in the Dunello allowed for the expansion of agriculture, trade, and industry. Kings like Ivar the Bonus and Harold Fairhair expanded Viking territory and influence by using the wealth accumulated from both raiding and trade to secure their power and maintain control over conquered regions. Military power and control. The elite warriors and strategic importance of fortresses. The Viking elite were not only wealthy merchants and rulers, they were also elite warriors, deeply involved in maintaining military control over their territories. Military power was integral to Viking kingship, and the wealth generated from trade and raids enabled these elites to build armies, recruit mercenaries, and establish fortifications and defenses that protected their growing empire. A significant element of Viking military power was the Varangian Guard, a group of elite warriors who served as mercenaries for the Byzantine Empire. These mercenaries, often composed of Viking warriors, gained prestige and wealth through their service and brought back not only gold and spoils from their campaigns, but also military knowledge and advanced tactics that enhanced Viking power back home. The presence of Vikings in Constantinople as part of the Varangian Guard helped solidify Viking influence in the Mediterranean and Eastern Europe, opening further opportunities for trade and expansion. The fortresses and settlements built by Viking elites also played a strategic role in expanding Viking influence. In the North Sea and Baltic regions, Viking kings established strongholds in places like Dublin and York, ensuring control over vital trade routes and serving as key military and economic centers. These fortified towns were crucial not only for securing Viking territory, but also for organizing raids and trade expeditions, making them essential for the long-term survival and prosperity of Viking society. The wealth, trade networks, and military power of the Viking elite were inextricably linked, forming the backbone of Viking society's success. Through strategic trade routes that connected Scandinavia to the Mediterranean, Middle East, and Asia, the Vikings built immense wealth, which in turn allowed their leaders to expand their influence and power. Viking elites were not only warriors but also masters of trade and commerce, using their resources to fund military campaigns, support alliances, and establish fortified settlements that ensured their control over vast territories. The role of the Viking elite in securing military power was just as critical to their legacy. Through mercenary service, like that in the Varangian Guard, and the establishment of strongholds, Viking kings and chieftains cemented their authority over not just Scandinavian lands, but far-reaching territories in Eastern Europe, the Byzantine Empire, and England. The Vikings' success in combining economic strength with military dominance enabled them to leave an indelible mark on the world, with their trade networks, warrior culture, and settlements shaping the course of European history for centuries. The Varangian Guard was one of the most iconic military units of the Byzantine Empire, known for its fearsome warriors, unwavering loyalty, and critical role in defending the Byzantine Empire. The origins of the Varangian Guard trace back to the early 10th century, when the Byzantine Emperor Basil II, also known as the Bulgar Slayer, recruited Viking mercenaries to serve as his elite bodyguards. Vikings from Scandinavia, particularly from Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, were chosen for their fearlessness and combat prowess, qualities that made them perfect candidates for this prestigious and crucial position. The decision to form the Varangian Guard came as a response to the Byzantine Empire's. The Byzantine army was often filled with mercenaries from various regions, but the Vikings stood out for their brutality in battle and their unwavering loyalty to their employers. The Byzantines were in a period of political instability, and having a reliable, elite military force was vital for maintaining the power of the emperor. The Vikings, who had long been skilled in naval warfare and raiding, proved to be highly effective on the battlefield. Their fierce reputation and skills in close combat made them a natural fit for defending the Byzantine emperors, and their inclusion in the imperial military added a powerful dimension to the Byzantine defense system. The recruitment process for the Varangian Guard was relatively straightforward, at least in terms of the Vikings' participation. Vikings, particularly those with a reputation for warfare and bravery, were offered contracts to serve in the Byzantine Empire as mercenaries. Their primary incentive was the wealth they could acquire by serving as part of the emperor's elite force, which included land, gold, and prestige. Many Viking warriors were also motivated by the opportunity to gain political connections, and some even used service in the Guard as a stepping stone to greater influence in both Byzantine and Scandinavian politics. The Vikings who joined the Varangian Guard were typically rewarded with wealth that could not have been obtained through local raids alone. Serving in the Byzantine Empire offered land grants, titles, and privileges that could be passed on to their descendants. Additionally, being part of the Guard meant they had access to the Byzantine court, a hub of power, luxury, and culture. For the Vikings, this was an opportunity not just for monetary gain, but for social advancement as well. However, the rewards for the Vikings went beyond just wealth. The prestige of being part of the Varangian Guard carried immense significance. Vikings who served as part of the Guard gained a level of honor and respect in both Byzantine society and their native lands. Their positions as elite warriors in the Byzantine Imperial Army elevated their status and reputation far beyond what could have been achieved in Viking society alone. The connections and influence they gained through their service in the Byzantine Empire could provide them with the opportunity to rise to positions of power within Viking society. The formation of the Varangian Guard had a profound impact on both the Byzantine Empire and Viking society. For the Byzantines, the arrival of the Vikings strengthened the emperor's military presence and solidified their defense systems. The Vikings were reliable and loyal, and their ability to defend the emperor during moments of crisis made them indispensable. Their sheer ferocity in battle, as well as their elite status, meant that the emperor could trust them in some of the most dangerous situations, particularly when faced with internal revolts or external threats. Politically, the Viking presence in the Byzantine Empire helped foster closer ties between the Scandinavian kingdoms and the Byzantine state. Over time, some Viking leaders formed alliances with Byzantine Empire, which not only improved their military and political standing in their homeland, but also helped increase Viking influence across Europe. Vikings who served in the Byzantine court brought back knowledge, wealth, and influence to Scandinavia, enriching their dynasties and kingdoms. On the flip side, the impact of the Varangian Guard on Viking society was equally significant. The exposure to Byzantine culture, including art, religion, and philosophy, left lasting marks on Viking society. Some Vikings, after serving in the Byzantine Empire, returned to Scandinavia with new ideas and a deeper understanding of the wider world. The contact with Byzantine and Eastern Orthodox Christianity would eventually contribute to the Christianization of Scandinavia, although the process was slow and spread out over several centuries. One of the most important aspects of the Varangian Guard's presence in the Byzantine Empire was the military training and expertise that Vikings brought with them. The Vikings were excellent fighters, known for their raiding tactics and naval expertise, and they passed on their combat techniques to the Byzantine army. The shield walls, hit-and-run tactics, and longship strategies used by the Vikings would leave an indelible mark on the Byzantine military system, contributing to the empire's ability to defend itself against various threats. In return, the Byzantines introduced the Vikings to Eastern Christian rituals, Byzantine arts, and literature. Some Vikings who served in the Guard were introduced to Byzantine religion and the Greek Orthodox Church, which influenced their views on faith and culture. As Christianity began to take root in Scandinavia, these early Varangian mercenaries would have helped create the bridge for a deeper, cultural exchange that would shape the religious landscape of Viking society. The artistic influence of Byzantium also impacted Viking culture. The Vikings adopted Byzantine styles in their weaponry, armor, and even architecture. The fusion of Byzantine art with Norse motifs led to unique hybrid forms of Viking craftsmanship, visible in Viking artifacts that blended Eastern and Northern European styles. The service of Vikings in the Varangian Guard provided a gateway for Viking leaders to gain prestige and political connections. By serving the Byzantine emperor, Viking chieftains and warriors could forge valuable alliances that would help them expand their influence in both Scandinavia and the Mediterranean. For some Viking kings and warlords, joining the Varangian Guard was a way to ensure security, both in their homeland and in the larger world. For instance, Viking leaders could leverage their service in the Guard to strengthen ties with the Byzantine Empire. In return, the Byzantine Empire benefited from the Guard's service and the military support they received during crucial campaigns. Through their service, Vikings were able to solidify their status as trusted mercenaries and gain new wealth, prestige, and influence in both Eastern and Western European courts. Viking rulers, like Harald Hardrada of Norway, would later use the experience gained from their service in the Varangian Guard as a stepping stone to seek greater territorial power in Scandinavia. Harald Hardrada's experience in Byzantium would later influence his claim to the English throne in 1066, highlighting how the service in the Guard served not only as military service but as an important diplomatic tool for Vikings looking to expand their reach. The Varangian Guard represented a key moment in the cultural exchange between the Viking and Byzantine worlds, blending the military prowess of the Vikings with the wealth, culture, and politics of the Byzantine Empire. For Vikings, the Guard was a pathway to prestige, wealth, and influence in the Mediterranean world, as well as an important avenue for expanding political power back in Scandinavia. In return, the Byzantine Empire benefited greatly from the Vikings' martial skills, loyalty, and ability to engage in difficult military campaigns. The legacy of the Varangian Guard lives on as a symbol of the strategic alliances and cultural exchanges that shaped Viking society and its connections to the broader world. Through the military and cultural influence of the Byzantine Empire, the Viking elite gained valuable skills, wealth, and prestige that helped them to leave their mark on both the Byzantine world and their own homeland. The Varangian Guard remains one of the most iconic examples of Viking service beyond Scandinavia, contributing to the global legacy of the Viking Age. Once Viking kings and chieftains secured military power and established their dominance in the regions they conquered, the next logical step was to shift from raiding to settling. This transition marked a pivotal moment in Viking history, as the previously nomadic raiders began establishing permanent settlements that would solidify their control over the lands they had conquered. For Viking rulers, the establishment of these settlements was more than just an expansion of territory. It was a means to consolidate their power, provide stability for their people, and ensure their legacy would endure. Viking kings, such as Harald Fairhair of Norway and Ivar the Boneless, began to see the value in transforming their newfound territories into sustainable communities. In regions like England, the Vikings did not just raid and leave. They settled, integrated with the local population, and began building infrastructure. One of the most notable examples of Viking settlement was the creation of the Danelaw, where Viking rule was established following numerous successful raids. The Danelaw became a kingdom in its own right, ruled by Viking kings who consolidated power through a combination of military force, strategic alliances, and the establishment of local governance. These new settlements were vital to Viking society. Once established, they allowed Viking kings to extract taxes, build trade routes, and increase economic output. Settlements became thriving hubs of commerce, where Viking elites and traders could exchange goods with local populations and other cultures. This economic foundation provided a steady income for Viking rulers and helped to secure their authority over the lands they controlled. The Vikings were masters of expansion, and their kings were adept at turning conquered regions into new kingdoms. The most famous example of this was the establishment of the Danelaw in England, where Viking influence grew through a combination of conquest, settlement, and treaties. After their successful raids across Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Viking kings like Ivar the Boneless and Guthrum established control over large swathes of England. They imposed Viking law, established new towns and fortifications, and began the process of integration into the existing political landscape. In addition to the Danelaw, Viking kings also created kingdoms in Normandy and even in the Mediterranean. The Normans eventually became some of the most famous rulers in Europe, with William the Conqueror famously becoming the King of England in 1066. Viking rulers were able to establish these kingdoms by capitalizing on their military successes and their ability to forge strategic alliances through marriage and diplomacy. In these new kingdoms, Viking rulers adopted a legal system that blended pagan traditions with local customs. Over time, Viking rulers enacted their own laws to ensure order in their growing territories. These laws often regulated trade, land ownership, and military service, helping to stabilize the new Viking kingdoms and allowing them to prosper. By setting up settlements and a functioning legal system, Viking kings were able to transform once volatile raiding regions into prosperous and sustainable territories. The expansion of Viking rule and the establishment of settlements marked a profound transformation in Viking society. Originally a nomadic and raiding society, the Vikings gradually evolved into a more settled civilization. The transition from raiding to agriculture, settlement, and trade changed the structure of Viking society, especially for the elite. Viking kings and chieftains, once solely focused on conquest, now had to focus on administration and the governance of their newly acquired lands. Social structures began to emerge in Viking kingdoms, with leaders overseeing the construction of towns, fortresses, and farms. Kings and chieftains were responsible for organizing settlements, securing land grants, and regulating resources. They had to ensure that their people had food, security, and a stable living environment. This shift from warrior societies to agricultural communities was crucial in ensuring the long-term survival of the Vikings. The Viking elite, who had once been solely defined by their martial abilities, now also began to be recognized for their ability to manage resources, resolve disputes, and secure economic stability. Viking society began to resemble that of the larger medieval European kingdoms, with laws and systems of justice emerging alongside military power. One of the most significant transformations during the Viking Age was the Christianization of Scandinavia. This process was largely driven by Viking kings, who saw the political and cultural advantages of adopting Christianity. Kings such as Harald Bluetooth of Denmark and Olaf Tryggvason of Norway played pivotal roles in the conversion of the Viking elite and their people. Harald Bluetooth famously adopted Christianity and promoted it within his kingdom as a way to unite his people under a single faith and create stronger alliances with Christian rulers in Europe. Harald's conversion was politically motivated, as the Christian faith provided him with greater influence among European monarchs and allowed for diplomatic and trade relationships with the Christian Byzantine Empire and the Holy Roman Empire. His reign marked the beginning of the Christianization of Denmark, a process that would continue to reshape Viking society. Similarly, Olaf Tryggvason played a central role in converting Norway to Christianity. After being baptized in the Byzantine Empire, Olaf returned to Norway and used his newfound faith to consolidate power. He built churches, enforced Christian laws, and sought to eliminate pagan practices. Like Harold, Olaf used Christianity as a political tool to solidify his rule and gain the favor of European monarchs. The conversion to Christianity was not just a religious shift. It had profound cultural and political consequences. The Viking world, once steeped in Norse mythology and pagan rituals, began to align itself with the broader Christianized Europe. The Vikings' trade and diplomatic relations expanded as a result of their conversion, making it easier for them to integrate into European political structures. Christianity also influenced the development of Viking art, architecture, and law, introducing new symbols, church buildings, and Christian motifs into Viking culture. The transformation of Viking society from nomadic raiders to settled kingdoms was driven by the actions of Viking kings and chiefs. As these leaders shifted their focus from raids to settlements, they laid the foundation for the establishment of lasting Viking kingdoms across Europe. Kings like Harald Bluetooth and Olaf Tryggvason played a pivotal role in both the expansion and the Christianization of their territories, marking a profound shift in Viking culture and its integration into the larger medieval European world. The cultural and religious transformation brought about by the Vikings, settlement and conversion to Christianity ensured that Viking culture would continue to influence Europe well into the Middle Ages. Viking kings, through their military, legal, and religious reforms, helped shape the future of not only Scandinavia, but also the broader European political landscape. Their ability to adapt and evolve from fierce raiders to effective rulers and settlers was a key factor in the enduring legacy of Viking influence on the world. Viking kingship was deeply intertwined with the spiritual realm, where rulers were often viewed as possessing a divine connection to the gods, especially Odin, Thor, and other major deities from the Norse pantheon. Unlike kings in other parts of medieval Europe, who were often seen as divinely appointed by God, Viking rulers were considered to have a direct link to the gods themselves, particularly through their strength and bravery. This belief in a divine connection played a crucial role in solidifying the power and legitimacy of Viking kings. The Vikings' pagan religion placed great emphasis on the gods' favor, and their kings were seen as embodiments of divine will. A king's ability to lead successful raids and conquests was often interpreted as proof of his favor with the gods. The more successful a king was in battle, the more his people believed he had the blessing of Odin, the god of war, wisdom, and death, who was revered as the protector of warriors. Likewise, the power of Thor, the thunder god, was often invoked to signify the might and strength of a ruler. In the Viking world, the gods were not distant figures, but actively involved in the lives of the people, particularly their rulers. A king's role was not only to govern his people, but also to act as a mediator between the divine and the mortal. Through his wisdom, strength, and military success, a Viking king embodied the virtues of the gods, ensuring that his people remained protected and prosperous. The idea of divine kingship meant that the power of a Viking king was not simply earthly, but also seen as a manifestation of divine approval. Viking kings were not simply rulers by virtue of birthright, but were believed to be chosen by the gods. The idea that kings were selected through divine intervention was central to Viking notions of kingship. Unlike hereditary monarchies, where power was passed down through bloodlines, the Vikings held that a king's worthiness to rule was proven through his actions, both in battle and in leadership. A king's military prowess, his ability to lead in combat, and his charisma was seen as signs of his divine appointment. Ragnar Lothbrok, one of the most famous Viking kings, is often depicted in sagas as a man chosen by the gods because of his wisdom and bravery. His rise to power was portrayed as the fulfillment of divine will. His success in raiding, his wisdom in leadership, and his survival against odds were signs that he was favored by Odin. Similarly, Harald Fairhair, who is credited with uniting Norway, was believed to have gained his power through divine favor, particularly after his victory in battle that was interpreted as a sign that Odin had blessed him. In Viking culture, kingship was sacred, and the rulers were not only warriors, but were expected to embody the values of the gods. Their victories in battle were seen as proof of their divine favor, and their failures were often viewed as signs of divine displeasure. A king's strength and victories on the battlefield were perceived as evidence of the god's direct involvement in his reign. further cementing his role as both a military leader and a spiritual figure for his people. As spiritual leaders, Viking kings played a central role in performing religious ceremonies, sacrifices, and rituals designed to ensure the prosperity and well-being of their kingdoms. The Viking worldview was deeply connected to their religion, and kings were responsible for upholding the gods' favor through rituals that ensured fertility, victory in battle, and successful harvests. One of the most important aspects of Viking kingship was the king's role in sacrifices to the gods. These sacrifices, which could include animals or humans, were meant to appease the gods and ensure their favor. Kings often led these sacrifices, ensuring that the gods were honored in a way that would guarantee the prosperity of their people. A king's ability to perform these rituals successfully and to lead with divine favor was a key part of his legitimacy. During periods of war, kings would often lead their people in battle sacrifices to the gods, seeking divine intervention for victory. Odin, the god of war, was often invoked for his guidance and strength in battle, while Thor was called upon for protection and power. Kings, like Olaf Tryggvason, were not just military leaders, but also religious figures, acting as intermediaries between the divine and mortal realms. Their authority was strengthened by their ability to lead their people in religious matters, just as much as their military campaigns. However, this religious role also created tension, especially with the increasing influence of Christianity. As Christianity spread across Europe, Viking kings found themselves navigating the changing religious landscape. Some kings, like Harald Bluetooth of Denmark and Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, were pivotal in introducing and promoting Christianity among their people, and their conversions to Christianity had significant political and cultural consequences. The eventual decline of Viking royal power was influenced by several factors, with the most significant being the Christianization of Viking societies and the rise of centralized monarchies in Europe. The conversion of Viking kings to Christianity marked a turning point in Viking culture, as it signaled the end of the traditional pagan-based kingship and the rise of a Christian monarchy. Kings like Harald Bluetooth were instrumental in promoting Christianity in their realms. Harald's conversion, which he likely saw as a means of strengthening his position in Europe and securing alliances with Christian rulers, was a turning point for Denmark and Scandinavia. The adoption of Christianity, along with the associated political systems and norms, gradually eroded the traditional pagan beliefs that had been central to Viking kingship. The Christian Church provided new forms of spiritual legitimacy, and the papacy offered kings a new source of authority, which ultimately diluted the divine aspect of Viking kingship. The rise of centralized monarchies across Europe also contributed to the decline of Viking royal power. As Viking kings sought to expand their influence, they encountered more powerful centralized states in Europe, which began to overshadow the Viking kingdoms. The Norman conquest of England in 1066, led by William the Conqueror, a descendant of Vikings, symbolized the end of the Viking Age, as it marked the culmination of Viking influence in England. Moreover, the increasing power of the Christian Church, combined with the adoption of European feudal systems, transformed the role of Viking kings. As feudal monarchies took hold, the direct connection between Viking rulers and the gods began to fade, and Viking kings became more like medieval European monarchs, bound by Christianity and the laws of the Church rather than their divine warrior status. Viking kings were seen as sacred figures, chosen by the gods, and responsible for both the spiritual and military welfare of their people. Their roles as warriors, religious leaders, and political figures made them powerful symbols of Viking strength and legitimacy. However, the eventual Christianization of Scandinavia and the rise of centralized monarchies marked the decline of the traditional Viking kingship, transforming the once divine rulers into more conventional European monarchs. Despite the end of the pagan kingship system, the legacy of Viking kings remains integral to the history of Scandinavia, shaping the course of European politics and culture for centuries. The influence of Viking kings and elites on modern Europe cannot be overstated. Their military campaigns, strategic alliances, and settlements played a crucial role in shaping the political landscape of Northern Europe and beyond. The Viking Age, which spanned from the late 8th century to the 11th century, marked a period of transformation where Viking rulers helped to carve out new kingdoms and territories across Britain, Ireland, France, and even Eastern Europe. Viking rulers like Harald Fairhair, who unified Norway, and Ragnar Loth, who epitomized the Viking warrior ethos, laid the groundwork for the future Scandinavian kingdoms. These kings not only expanded Viking influence, but also helped establish the foundations for the political and social systems that would evolve into medieval Europe. For example, the Danelaw in England, ruled by Viking kings, contributed to the formation of England's legal and cultural structures, which would later shape the entire island's future governance. Viking rulers were also instrumental in the spread of Christianity throughout Scandinavia. Kings like Harald Bluetooth and Olaf Tryggvason embraced Christianity, significantly altering the religious landscape of Northern Europe. This cultural shift had long-lasting effects, as it integrated Scandinavia into Christian Europe, changing everything from politics to cultural identity. Their legacy extends beyond military conquests and territorial expansion. Viking kings helped to shape the concepts of kingship and rule in a way that would influence the monarchies of later medieval Europe. Their blend of warrior tradition and pragmatic governance created a model for leadership that would be adopted by later European rulers, leaving an indelible mark on European history. Today, Viking kings are viewed not only as warriors and conquerors, but as symbols of resilience and leadership. The historical significance of these kings is often romanticized in popular culture, where figures like Ragnar Lothbrok and Harald Fairhair are portrayed as legendary heroes, embodying the spirit of adventure, courage, and ambition. This portrayal has helped cement their place in modern imagination as the embodiment of Viking greatness, often portrayed as larger-than-life characters in books, TV shows, and movies. In particular, the sagas and epic tales of Viking kings have been widely adapted in modern media, fueling an enduring fascination with Viking culture and leadership. Television shows like Vikings have brought Viking kings to the forefront, giving them complex personalities and heroic qualities, blending historical events with mythological elements. This portrayal, though often dramatized, has sparked renewed interest in Viking history and the roles these kings played in shaping the world. The legacy of Viking kings is not limited to the distant past. Their influence is still deeply felt in Scandinavian culture and political structures today. In countries like Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, Viking heritage remains a powerful part of national identity, influencing everything from art and literature to national holidays and festivals. The Viking kings, through their military triumphs, cultural integration, and nation, laid the foundation for modern Scandinavian society. In the academic world, Viking kings continue to be a major subject of study. Historians and archaeologists delve into the complexities of Viking kingship, examining how these rulers maintained control over vast territories, implemented laws, and shaped the social and economic dynamics of the time. Viking kings were instrumental in the transition from a pagan society to a Christianized Europe, making them key figures in understanding the broader cultural shifts of the medieval period. Culturally, the Viking influence can still be seen in modern Scandinavian societies, where values such as community solidarity, honor, and resilience remain integral to national identity. The royal families of Scandinavia, such as the Kingdom of Norway, trace their roots back to Viking kings, maintaining a symbolic connection to their Viking ancestors and the leadership model they established. The legacy of Viking kings and their elites has endured through history, culture, and modern perceptions. Their military success, political acumen, and religious transformations not only shaped the medieval world, but laid the foundations for the societies we know today. From the creation of new kingdoms to the establishment of lasting cultural traditions, the Viking rulers left an indelible mark on Europe's political and cultural landscape. In popular culture, Viking kings are immortalized as symbols of bravery, honor, and leadership, with modern portrayals of these figures continuing to shape our perception of the Viking era. As scholars continue to explore the complexities of Viking kingship, their influence remains deeply ingrained in both Scandinavian national identity and European history. The enduring legacy of Viking royalty is a testament to their lasting impact, not only on their time but also on the world that followed.